Million-Word Reading Project. Collection 1. Book 11. Huckleberry Finn. Produced by Million-Word Reading Project Workshop. Chapter 1. Tom Sawyer Waits. You won't know about me unless you have read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. Now the book ends like this: Tom and I found the money that the robbers hid in the cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 each, all gold. Well, Judge Thatcher kept it for us and gave us an interest of $1 a day each all the year round, too much for one to spend. The widow Douglas took me for her son, but I couldn't stand the life in her house, so I ran out. I got into my old rags and my barrel again and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer found me and said he was going to start a band of robbers and I might join if I would go back to the widow. So I went back. The widow cried over me. She put me in the new clothes again, and I couldn't do anything but sweat and feel uncomfortable. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke and asked the widow to let me. But she wouldn't. Her sister, Miss Watson, a slim old maid with glasses on, had just come to live with her. She made me work on a spelling book. I couldn't stand it any longer. Miss Watson kept finding fault with me, and it got tiresome. I went up to my room with a piece of candle and put it on the table. Then I sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think of something cheerful, but it was no use. I got out my pipe for a smoke. The house was still now, and the widow wouldn't know. Well, after a long time I heard the clock away off in the town striking 12. Pretty soon I heard a branch breaking down in the dark among the trees. Something was moving. I sat still and listened. At once I could just hear a meow, meow. Down there. That was good. I said meow, meow, as softly as I could, and then I put out the light and climbed out of the window. I slipped down to the ground and, sure enough, there was Tom Sawyer waiting for me. Chapter 2. Tom Sawyer's Gang. We went tiptoeing among the trees back towards the end of the widow's garden. When we were passing by the kitchen I fell over a root and made a noise. We lay down and kept still. Miss Watson's big nigger, named Jim, was sitting in the kitchen door. He got up and listened about a minute. Then he said, "Who's there?" He listened some more, then he came tiptoeing down and stood right between us. Pretty soon Jim said, "Say, who are you?" I heard something. Well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit down here and listen. So he sat down on the ground between Tom and me. After 6 or 7 minutes, Jim began to breathe heavily. Next he began to snore. Tom made a sign to me, a little noise with his mouth, and we went creeping away on our hands and knees. Well, when Tom and I got to the edge of the hilltop we looked away down into the village and could see 3 or 4 lights shining. Down by the village was the river, a whole mile broad, and quite still and grand. We went down the hill and found Joe Harper and Ben Rogers and 2 or 3 more of the boys hidden in the old tanyard. So we found a boat and pulled down the river 2.5 miles to the big scar on the hillside and went on land. We went to some bushes and Tom made everybody swear to keep the secret and then showed them a hole in the hill right in the thickest part of the bushes. Then we lit the candles and crawled in on our hands and knees. We went about 200 yards and then the cave opened up. We went along a narrow place and got into a kind of room, all damp and cold, and there we stopped. Tom said, "Now, we'll start this band of robbers and call it Tom Sawyer's Gang. Everybody that wants to join has to take an oath and write his name in blood." Everybody was willing. So Tom got out a sheet of paper that he had written the oath on and read it. Everybody said it was a beautiful oath and asked Tom if he got it out of his own head. He said, some of it, but the rest was out of pirate books and robber books. We planned to stop carriages on the road with masks on and kill the people and take their watches and money. Must we always kill the people? We'll bring some of them to the cave here and keep them till they're ransomed. Ransomed? But what does that mean? I've seen it in books, and so of course that's what we've got to do. But how can we do it if we don't know what it is? Why, we've got to do it. Didn't I tell you it's in the books? Do you want to do differently from what's in the books? Oh, that's all very fine to say, Tom Sawyer, but how are these fellows going to be ransomed if we don't know how to do it? Now, what do you suppose it is? Well, I don't know. But perhaps it means that we keep them till they're dead. Now, that's it. Why couldn't you say that before? We'll keep them till they're ransomed to death, and they'll eat up everything, and always try to get loose. How you talk, Ben Rogers. How can they get loose when there's a guard over them, ready to shoot them down if they move? A guard? Well, that is good. So somebody's got to sit up all night and never get any sleep, just so as to watch them. I think that's foolish. Why can't a body take a stick and ransom them as soon as they get here? Because it isn't in the books, so that's why. Now, Ben Rogers, don't you suppose that the people that made the books knew what's the correct thing to do? Do you suppose you can teach them anything? No, sir, we'll just ransom them in the regular way. All right. I don't mind, but I say it's a foolish way, anyhow. Say, do we kill the women too? Kill the women? No, nobody ever saw anything in the books like that. You fetch them to the cave, and you're always very polite to them, and soon they will never want to go home anymore. Well, then, very soon we'll have the cave so crowded with women and fellows waiting to be ransomed that there won't be place for the robbers. But go ahead, I have got nothing to say. Little Tommy Barnes was asleep now, and when they woke him up he was scared. He cried and said he wanted to go home to his ma and didn't want to be a robber anymore. So they all made fun of him and called him crybaby. That made him mad, and he said he would go straight and tell all the secrets. But Tom gave him 5 cents to keep quiet and said we would all go home and meet next week and rob somebody and kill some people. They agreed to get together and fix a day as soon as they could, and then we elected Tom Sawyer first captain and Joe Harper second captain of the gang. And so they started home. I climbed into my window just before day was breaking. My new clothes were all dirty, and I was very tired. Chapter 3. Huck's father is drunk again. Well, old Miss Watson got angry with me in the morning on account of my clothes, but the widow only cleaned my clothes and looked so sorry that I thought I would be good a while if I could. We hadn't seen Pap for more than a year, and that was comfortable for me. I didn't want to see him anymore. He used to beat me when he was drunk and could get hold of me, though I used to run into the woods most of the time when he was around. We played robber now and then, about a month, and we stopped. We hadn't robbed anybody, hadn't killed any people, but only just pretended. Well, 3 or 4 months passed, and it was winter now. I had been to school almost all the time and could spell and read and write just a little and could say the multiplication table up to 6 times 7 is 35, and I suppose that's the best I can do. I don't take any interest in mathematics, anyway. I was getting used to the widow's ways, too, and they weren't so hard on me. One morning, there was an inch of new snow on the ground, and I saw somebody's tracks. They had stood around the fence a while and then went on around it. It was funny they hadn't come in after standing around so. When I looked at them more carefully, I found they were my paps. It was very curious, so I followed the tracks down the hill. I looked over my shoulder every now and then, but I didn't see anybody. I was soon at Judge Thatcher's. He said, "Why, my boy, you are all out of breath. Did you come for your interest?" "No, sir," I said. "Is there some for me?" "Oh, yes, over $150 for half a year. Quite a fortune for you. You had better let me invest it along with your $6,000, because if you take it, you'll spend it." "No, sir," I said. "I don't want to spend it. I don't want it at all, or the $6,000 either. I want you to take it, I want to give it all to you." He looked surprised. "Why, what can you mean, my boy?" said he. I said, "Don't you ask me any questions about it, please." He studied a while, and then he said, "Oh, I think I see. You want to sell all your property to me, not give it. That's the correct idea." Then he wrote something on a paper and read it over to me. I signed it and left. When I lit my candle and went up to my room that night, there sat Pap, waiting for me. He was almost 50. His hair was long and dirty and hung down, and you could see his eyes shining through, as if he was behind vines. There wasn't any color in his face. His clothes were just rags. He had one ankle resting on the other knee. The boot on that foot was worn. 2 of his toes stuck through, and he moved them now and then. His black hat was lying on the floor. I stood looking at him. He sat there looking at me, with his chair leaning back a little. I set the candle down. I noticed a window was up, so he had climbed in through it. He kept looking me all over. By and by he said, "Tidy clothes, very. You think you're a gentleman, don't you? You're educated too, they say, can read and write. You think you're better than your father now, don't you? Who told you you could go to school?" "The widow. She told me." "Now, look here, you dropped that school, you hear? Your mother couldn't read before she died. None of the family could before they died. I can't either. I cannot stand it, you hear? Say, let me hear you read." I took up a book and began something about General Washington and the wars. When I'd read about half a minute, he seized the book with his hand and threw it across the house. He said, "I've been in town 2 days, and I have heard you are rich. You get me that money tomorrow, I want it." "I haven't got any money, I tell you." "You ask Judge Thatcher, he'll tell you the same." "All right. I'll ask him, and I'll make him pay too, or I'll find out why. Say, how much have you got in your pocket?" "I want it. I have only $1, and I want that too." "It doesn't make any difference what you want it for, you just give it to me." He took it, and then he said he was going downtown to get some whiskey. He hadn't had a drink all day. Next day he was drunk, and he went to Judge Thatcher's and tried to make him give up the money, but he couldn't, and then he swore he'd make the law force him. He said he'd whip me till I was black and blue if I didn't raise some money for him. I borrowed $3 from Judge Thatcher, and Pap took it and got drunk. He went around the town and made trouble, then they jailed him for a week. But he said he was satisfied, he was boss of his son. Chapter 4. Life in the Woods. Pap caught me a couple of times and whipped me, but I went to school just the same. I didn't want to go to school much before, but I supposed I'd go now to make Pap angry. Every now and then I'd borrow $2 or $3 from the judge for him, to keep him from whipping me. Every time he got money he got drunk, every time he got drunk he made trouble around town, and every time he made trouble he got jailed. He started hanging around the widows too much, and so she told him at last to stay away. He said he would show who was Huck Finn's boss. So he watched out for me one day in the spring and caught me. He took me up the river about 3 miles in a boat and crossed over to the Illinois shore. There weren't any houses in the thick woods, but an old log hut. He kept me with him all the time, and I never got a chance to run off. We lived in that old hut, and he always locked the door and put the key under his head at nights. He had a gun which I suppose he had stolen, and we fished and hunted, and that was what we lived on. The widow found out where I was by and by, and she sent a man over to try to get hold of me, but Pap drove him off with the gun. It wasn't long before I became used to being where I was and liked it, except the whipping. It was lazy and fun, smoking and fishing, and no books nor study. I didn't want to go back anymore. But by and by, Pap began to hit me so much that I couldn't stand it. He started going away so much too, and locking me in. Once he locked me in and was gone 3 days. It was very lonely. I judged he had got drowned, and I wasn't ever going to get out anymore. I was scared. When he finally came back, he said he had been downtown, and everything was going wrong. His lawyer said he supposed he would win and get the money if they ever started the trial, but then there were ways to put it off a long time, and Judge Thatcher knew how to do it. He wanted me to go and live with the widow. This made me sad because I didn't want to go back to the widow's anymore. The old man made me go to the boat and fetch the things he had got. I sat down on the boat to rest and thought it all over. I supposed I would walk off with the gun and some lines and run into the woods. I guessed I wouldn't stay in one place, but just walk right across the country, mostly at night, and hunt and fish to keep alive. In this way, I would get so far away that the old man or the widow couldn't ever find me anymore. I judged I would leave that night if Pap got drunk enough, and I supposed he would. I was staying when the old man shouted and asked me whether I was asleep or drowned. I got the things all up to the cabin, and then it was about dark. After supper Pap began to drink his whiskey. I judged he would be completely drunk in about an hour, and then I would steal the key and run away. He drank and fell down on his blankets by and by, but he didn't fall asleep. At last I got so sleepy I couldn't keep my eyes open, and so before I knew it I was sound asleep. Chapter 5. Huck escapes from the cabin. The next day, Pap told me to go and catch some fish for breakfast. On the river bank, I noticed some branches floating down, so I knew the river had begun to rise. I went along up the bank with one eye out for Pap and the other one out for what the rise might fetch along. All at once here came a canoe, about 13 or 14 feet long, riding high like a duck. I jumped into the water like a frog and swam for the canoe. I climbed in and pulled her on land. But when I got to shore Pap wasn't in sight yet. Then I had an idea. I'd hide her, and then, instead of running into the woods when I ran off, I'd go down the river about 50 miles and camp in one place forever. In this way, I would not have such a hard time going on foot. After we had lunch, Pap decided to go to town. So he locked me in and took the boat and started off. I judged he wouldn't come back that night. Then I took out my saw and made a hole in the wooden wall of the cabin. I climbed out very easily. I took a bag of cornmeal, some bacon and whiskey, and took them to where the canoe was hidden and put them in. I took all the coffee and sugar there was. I took the gun, fish lines, matches and other things, everything that was worth a cent. Then I fixed a piece of log back into its place and put 2 rocks under it and one against it to hold it there. If you stood 4 or 5 feet away and didn't know it was sawed, you would never notice it. Besides, this was the back of the cabin, and it wasn't likely anybody would go there. Then I took the gun and went up into the woods. I was hunting around for some birds when I saw a wild pig. I shot this fellow and took him into the camp. I took the axe and broke the door open. I fetched the pig in, took him back nearly to the table, and cut open his throat with the axe. Then I laid him down on the ground to bleed. Next I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it. I dragged it to the door and through the woods down to the river and threw it in. It sank down, out of sight. You could easily see that something had been dragged over the ground. I did wish Tom Sawyer was there. I knew he would take an interest in this kind of business. I pulled out some of my hair, put some blood on the axe, and stuck the hair on the back side. Then I threw the axe in the corner. Next, I took up the pig down to the river and then threw him into it. I was careful not to drop any blood in doing so. It was about dark now, so I dropped the canoe down the river under some willows that hung over the bank and waited for the moon to rise. I lay down in the canoe to smoke a pipe and make a plan. I said to myself, they'll follow the track of that sack of rocks to the shore and then drag the river for me. They'll soon get tired of that and won't bother any more about me. All right, I can stop anywhere I want to. Jackson's Island is good enough for me. I know that island pretty well, and nobody ever comes there. And then I can cross the water over to town at night and pick up things I want. I was pretty tired, and the first thing I knew I was asleep. When I woke up I didn't know where I was for a minute. I sat up and looked around, a little scared. Then I remembered. The moon was very bright, and everything was quiet. I was just going to start when I heard a sound away over the water. I looked out through the willow branches, and there it was, a boat, away across the water. It kept coming, and when it was close to me, I saw there was but one man in it. He came up shore, and he went by so close I could have reached out the gun and touched him. Well, it was Pap, sure enough. I didn't lose any time. The next minute I was paddling downstream softly but quickly in the shade of the bank. I made 2.5 miles and then struck out 1/4 mile or more towards the middle of the river because pretty soon I would be passing the ferry landing and people might see me and call to me. I lay down in the bottom of the canoe and let her float. I lay there and had a good rest and a smoke out of my pipe, looking away into the sky, not a cloud in it. The sky looks ever so deep when you lie down on your back in the moonshine. I never knew it before. And how far one can hear on the water on such nights. I heard people talking at the ferry landing. I heard what they said too, every word of it. One man said it was getting towards the long days and the short nights now. I heard another man say it was nearly 3 o'clock. After that the talk got further and further away, and I couldn't make out the words anymore. I was away below the ferry now. I rose up, and there was Jackson's Island, about 2.5 miles downstream, with thick woods and standing up out of the middle of the river. It was big and dark, like a steamboat without any lights. It didn't take me long to get there. I shot past ahead at a great speed, and then I got into the dead water and landed on the side towards the Illinois shore. I hid the canoe among the trees so that nobody could have seen it from the outside. I went up and sat down on a log at the head of the island and looked out on the big river and away over to the town, 3 miles away, where there were 3 or 4 lights shining. There was a little gray in the sky now, so I stepped into the woods and lay down for a nap before breakfast. Chapter 6. Meeting Jim on the island. The sun was up so high when I woke that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I lay there in the grass and the cool shade, thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was falling asleep again when I heard a deep sound of boom. Away up the river. I sat up and listened. Pretty soon I heard it again. I jumped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I saw smoke lying on the water a long way up, about close to the ferry. And there was the ferry boat full of people floating along down. I knew what was the matter now. You see, they were firing a gun over the water, trying to make my body come to the top. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke and went on watching. Then the ferry boat came close, and I saw almost everybody was on the boat. Pap, and Judge Thatcher, and Bessie Thatcher, and Joe Harper, and Tom Sawyer, and his old Aunt Polly, and Sid and Mary, and plenty more. I could see them clearly, but they couldn't see me. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and after an hour, I didn't hear it anymore. I knew I was all right now. Nobody else would come hunting after me. I got my things out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of a tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get at them. I caught a fish, and towards sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. But by and by it became lonely, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the water running along and counted the stars and then went to bed. There isn't any better way to pass the time when you are lonely. The next day I went exploring around down through the island. I went along in the deep woods till I judged I wasn't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot anything, it was for protection. About this time I saw the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up. I got my gun ready and went back on my tiptoes as fast as ever I could. Every now and then I stopped a second among the thick leaves and listened, but I couldn't hear anything. When I got to the camp, I got all my things into my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and made it look like an old camp and then climbed a tree. I suppose I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see or hear anything. At last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. I could only eat berries and what was left over from breakfast. When it was night, I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two and then let the canoe float along among the shadows. The moon was shining And outside the shadows it was almost as light as day. I searched along for about an hour, and I was almost down to the foot of the island. I turned the canoe to shore. Then I got my gun and went into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. Now the day was coming. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. Soon, I saw fire away through the trees. I went for it carefully and slowly. When I was close enough to have a look, I found there lay a man on the ground. It almost frightened me. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind some bushes about 6 feet away from him and kept my eyes on him. Pretty soon he woke up and took off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I was glad to see him. So I jumped out and called, "Hello, Jim." He jumped up and stared at me. Then he dropped down on his knees and said, "Don't hurt me, don't. I haven't ever done any harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people and did all I could for them. You go and get in the river again and don't do anything to old Jim. I was always your friend." Well, I soon made him understand I wasn't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I wasn't lonely now. I told him I wasn't afraid he would tell the people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me without saying anything. Then he told me that he came here the night after I was killed. He had had nothing to eat but strawberries. So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire, I fetched cornmeal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan, and sugar in tin cups. I caught a good big fish, too, and Jim cleaned it with his knife and fried it. After breakfast, Jim said, "But look here, Huck, who was it that was killed in that hut if it wasn't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't make any better plan than what I had. Then he told me his story. "Well, you see, it was like this. Miss Watson finds fault with me all the time and treats me badly, but she always said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed there was a nigger trader round the place lately, and I began to get uneasy. Well, one night I heard old Miss Watson tell the widow she was going to sell me down to Orleans. She didn't want to, but she could get $800 for me, and it was such a lot of money she couldn't resist. The widow tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I ran out very quickly, I tell you. I ran down the hill and expected to steal a boat along the shore somewhere above the town, but there were people around, so I hid in an old house on the bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was there all night. At about 6 in the morning, boats began to go by, and about 8 or 9, every boat that went along was talking about how your pap came over to the town and said you were killed. I was terribly sorry you were killed, Huck, but I'm not anymore now. I hid there all day. When it became dark I went about 2 miles or more to where there weren't any houses. I went into the water and swam more than halfway across the river till a raft came along. So I climbed up and lay down on it. When I was almost down to the head of the island, a man began to come after me with a lantern, so I slid into the water and swam for the island. Well, I had thought I could land almost anywhere, but I couldn't, the bank was too steep. I was almost at the foot of the island before I found a good place. I went into the woods. I had my pipe and tobacco and some matches in my cap, and they weren't wet, so I was all right. Did you hear them shooting the gun? Oh, yes. I knew they were after you. I saw them go by here. I watched them through the bushes. Chapter 7. The Floating House. I wanted to go and look at a place right about the middle of the island that I'd found when I was exploring, so we started and soon got to it because the island was only 3 miles long and 1/4 mile wide. This place was a fairly long steep hill about 40 feet high. We had a hard time getting to the top. The sides were so steep and the bushes so thick. We walked and climbed around all over it and by found a good big cave in the rock. It was almost up to the top on the side towards Illinois. The cave was as big as 2 or 3 rooms put together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. So we went back and got the canoe and paddled up close to the cave and dragged all the things up there. Then we found a place close by to hide the canoe in, among the thick willows. Pretty soon it began to rain very hard. The river went on rising and rising for 12 days, till at last it was over the banks. The water was 3 or 4 feet deep on the island in the low places. In the daytime, we paddled all over the island in the canoe. It was very cool in the deep woods, even if the sun was shining outside. One night when we were up at the head of the island, just before daylight, we saw a wooden house coming down. It was a 2-story house. We paddled out and climbed in at an upstairs window. But it was too dark to see yet, so we hid the canoe and sat inside to wait for daylight. Daylight began to come in before we got to the foot of the island. Then we looked in at the window. We could see a bed and a table and 2 old chairs and lots of things around about on the floor, and there were clothes hanging against a wall. There was something lying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man. Jim went over and saw it was a dead man. He'd been shot in the back. I didn't look at him at all. There were 2 old dirty dresses and a sun bonnet and some women's underclothes hanging against a wall and some men's clothing, too. We put them into the canoe, they might be of some use. We also took some other things that we might need and got home all safe. Chapter 8. Huck dresses up as a girl. After breakfast I wanted to talk about the dead man, to figure out how he had gotten killed. But Jim didn't want to talk about it. He said it would bring bad luck. Besides, he said, the dead man might come and haunt us. He said that a man that hadn't been buried was more likely to haunt people than one that was planted comfortably in the ground. That sounded reasonable, so I kept quiet about it. Still, I couldn't help thinking it over and wishing I knew who had shot the man and why. We looked through the clothes we'd got and found $8 in silver sewed up in an old overcoat. Well, the days went along and the river went down between its banks again. We caught a fish that was as big as a man, 6 feet 2 inches long, and weighed over 200 pounds. It was the biggest fish that had ever been caught in the Mississippi, I suppose. Jim said he had never seen a bigger one. He would have been worth a good deal over at the village. The next morning I said it was getting boring and I wanted to do something exciting. I said I would slip over the river and find out what was going on. Jim liked that idea, but he said I must go in the dark. Then he studied it over and suggested that I put on some of the old clothes and dress up like a girl. That was a good idea too. So we cut one of the dresses short and I put it on. I put on the sun bonnet and tied it under my chin. Jim said nobody would know me, even in the daytime. I practiced around all day to get used to the things, and by I could do pretty well in them. I started up the Illinois shore in the canoe just after dark and reached the bottom of the town. I tied up the canoe and started along the bank. There was a light burning in a little hut that hadn't been lived in for a long time, and I wondered who was staying there. I slipped up and looked in at the window. There was a woman about 40 years old in there knitting by a candle on a table. I didn't know her face, she was a stranger. Now this was lucky. I was getting afraid I had come, people might know my voice and find me out. But if this woman had been in such a little town 2 days she could tell me all I wanted to know, so I knocked at the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl. Chapter 9. Huck and the Woman. Come in, said the woman, and I did. She said, take a chair. I did it. She looked me all over with her little bright eyes and said, what might your name be? Sarah Williams. Where do you live? In this neighborhood? No, ma'am. In Hookerville, 7 miles below. I've walked all the way, and I'm all tired out. Hungry too, I suppose. I'll find you something. No, ma'am, I'm not hungry. I was so hungry I had to stop 2 miles below here at a farm, so I'm not hungry anymore. That's why I am so late. My mother's sick. She is out of money and everything, and I have come to tell my Uncle Abner more. He lives at the upper end of the town, she said. I haven't ever been here before. Do you know him? No, I don't know anybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a long way to the upper end of the town. You'd better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet." "No," I said. "I'll rest a while, I suppose, and go on. I'm not afraid of the dark." She said she wouldn't let me go by myself. Her husband would be in by and by, maybe in an hour and a half, and she'd send him along with me. Then she started talking about her husband and about her family and so on, till I was afraid I had made a mistake coming to her to find out what was going on in the town. But by and by she began to talk about Pap and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her go right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000 and about Pap and me, and at last she began to talk about how I was murdered. I said, "Who did it? We've heard a lot about these things down in Hookerville, but we don't know who it was that killed Huck Finn." "Well, I suppose there are a lot of people here that'd like to know who killed him. Some think old Finn did it himself. But before night, they judged it was done by a runaway nigger named Jim." She talked on. "The nigger ran off the very night Huck Finn was killed. So there's a reward out for him, $300. Has everybody stopped thinking the nigger did it? Oh, no, not everybody. A good many think he did it. But they'll get the nigger pretty soon now." "Why, are they after him yet?" "Well, you're innocent, aren't you? Is there $300 every day for people to pick up? Some folks think the nigger isn't far from here. I'm one of them, but I haven't talked it around. A few days ago I was talking with an old couple that lives next door in the log hut, and they happened to say hardly anybody ever goes to Jackson's Island. They say nobody lives there. I was pretty sure I'd seen smoke over there, about the head of the island, a day or two before that. So I said to myself, maybe that nigger's hiding over there. Anyway," said I, "it's worth the trouble to give the place a hunt. I haven't seen any smoke since, so I suppose maybe he's gone, if it was him. But my husband's going over to see, he and another man. I told him as soon as he came home 2 hours ago. I had got so uneasy I couldn't sit still. I had to do something with my hands, so I took up a needle and began threading it. My hands shook, and I failed to do it. When the woman stopped talking I looked up, and she was looking at me curiously and smiling a little. I put down the needle and thread and pretended to be interested. $300 is a lot of money. I wish my mother could get it. Is your husband going over there tonight?" I said. "Oh, yes. He went to town with another man to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go over after midnight." The woman kept looking at me curiously, and I didn't feel comfortable at all. Pretty soon she said, "What did you say your name was, honey?" Mary Williams." "But," she said, "honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first came in." "Oh, yes, ma'am, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some call me Sarah, some call me Mary. Come, now, what's your real name?" What, ma'am? What's your real name? Is it Bill, or Tom, or Bob? Or what is it?" I suppose I shook like a leaf, and I hardly knew what to do. But I said, "Please don't make fun of a poor girl like me, ma'am. If I'm in the way here, I'll—" "No, you won't. Sit down and stay where you are. I'm not going to hurt you. You just tell me your secret and trust me. I'll keep it, and, what's more, I'll help you. So will my husband, if you want him to. You see, you're a runaway apprentice, that's all. Tell me all about it now, that's a good boy." Then I told her my father and mother were dead, and I lived with an old farmer in the country 30 miles away from the river. He treated me so badly I couldn't stand it any longer. He was away for a couple of days, and so I stole some of his daughter's old clothes and ran out. I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me. "What's your real name, now?" "George Peters, ma'am." "Well, try to remember it, George. You act poorly like a girl, but you might fool men, maybe. When you set out to thread a needle, don't hold the thread still and fetch the needle up to it, hold the needle still and direct the thread at it. That's the way a woman almost always does, but a man always does the other way. Now go along to your uncle and if you get into trouble you send word to Mrs. Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it." I found my canoe, jumped in, and was off in a hurry. When I was about the middle, I heard the clock begin to strike, so I stopped and listened. The sound came clearly over the water. 11. I landed and climbed into the cave. There Jim lay, sound asleep on the ground. I woke him up and said, "Get up, Jim. There isn't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked any questions, he never said a word, but the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time everything we had in the world was on our raft. I took the canoe out and tied it behind the raft. Then we got out the raft and slipped along down in the shade, past the foot of the island dead still, never saying a word. Chapter 10. Happy Days Down South. It must have been close to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go very slow. When day broke, we reached a sandbar in a big bend on the Illinois side. We lay there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats going along the river. We had very good weather, and nothing ever happened to us at all that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but lights. Not a house could you see. The fifth night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world. In St. Petersburg they used to say there were 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I saw that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There wasn't a sound there, everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip on land towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other things to eat. Mornings before daylight I slipped into fields and borrowed a melon or a pumpkin or some new corn or things of that kind. We shot a water bird now and then that got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. In all, we lived pretty happily. We judged that after 3 nights we would reach Cairo, at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we were after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go up the Ohio among the free states and then be out of trouble. Chapter 11. Running by Cairo. The next night, we were a little way behind a long raft. We judged she carried as many as 30 men, likely. She had 5 big huts aboard, wide apart, and an open campfire in the middle, and a tall flagpole at each end. We went floating down into a big bend, and the night clouded up and got hot. The river was very wide, and on both sides were thick woods. We talked about Cairo and wondered whether we would know it when we got to it. I said probably we wouldn't, because I had heard there were about a dozen houses there, and if they didn't happen to have them lit up, how were we going to know we were passing a town? Jim said if the 2 big rivers joined together there, that would show. But I said maybe we might think we were passing the foot of an island and coming into the same old river again. That troubled Jim, and me too. So the question was, what to do? I said, paddle on land the first time a light showed and ask how far it was to Cairo. Jim thought it was a good idea, so we took a smoke on it and waited. There wasn't anything to do now but to look out for the town and not pass it without seeing it. Jim said he'd be very sure to see it because he'd be a free man the minute he saw it, but if he missed it, he'd be in a slave country again and have no freedom. Jim said it made him excited to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me excited too, to hear him, because I began to think that he was almost free, and who was to blame for it? Why, me. Conscience said to me, what has poor Miss Watson done to you? How could you see her nigger go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her like this? Why, she tried to teach you your book, she tried to teach you your manners, she tried her best to be good to you. That's what she did. I started feeling so bad I almost wished I were dead. Neither of us could keep still. Every time he danced around and said, "There's Cairo," it went through me like a shot, and I thought, if it was Cairo I supposed I would die of shame. Jim was saying, when he got to a free state, He would begin saving up money and never spend a single cent. When he got enough, he would buy his wife, who was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived. Then they would both work to buy the 2 children. It almost frightened me to hear such talk. He wouldn't have dared to talk such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. I began looking out sharp for a light. By and by one showed. Jim sang out, "We're safe, Huck. We're safe. That's the good old Cairo at last, I just know it." I said, "I'll take the canoe and go and see, Jim. It might not be, you know." He jumped and got the canoe ready and put his old coat in the bottom for me to sit on and gave me the paddle. As I paddled off, he said, "Pretty soon I'll be shouting for joy and I'll say, it's all on account of Huck. I'm a free man and I couldn't have been free if it hadn't been for Huck. Huck did it. Jim won't ever forget you, Huck. You're the best friend Jim's ever had and you're the only friend old Jim's got now." I was paddling off, ready to tell on him, but when he said this, it seemed to take the courage all out of me. I went along slowly then, and I wasn't sure whether I was glad I started or whether I wasn't. When I was 50 yards off, Jim said, "There you go, the old true Huck, the only white gentleman that ever kept his promise to old Jim." Well, I just felt sick. But I said, "I have to do it, I can't get out of it." Right then along came a boat with 2 men in it with guns. They stopped and so did I. One of them said, "Any men on your raft?" "Only one, sir." "Well, 5 niggers ran off tonight up there, above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black?" I didn't answer up at once. I tried to, but the words wouldn't come. So I just gave up trying and said, "He's white. I suppose we'll go and see for ourselves." "I wish you would," said I, "because it's Pap there and maybe you'd help me pull the raft on land where the light is. He's sick and so is Ma'am and Mary Ann." "Oh. We're in a hurry, boy. But I suppose we've got to. Come, let's get along." When we had started, I said, "Pap will be very much thankful to you, I can tell you. Everybody goes away when I want them to help me with the raft, and I can't do it by myself. Say, boy, what's the matter with your father?" "It's well, it isn't anything much." They stopped. It was only a little way to the raft now. One said, "Boy, that's a lie. What is the matter with your pap? Answer now." "I will, sir, I will, but don't leave us please." "It's gentleman, if you'll only pull ahead and let me throw you the line, you won't have to come near the raft. Please do." "Set her back, John, set her back," said one. They backed their boat. "Keep away, boy. Your pap's got the smallpox, and you know it very well. Why didn't you say so? Do you want to spread it all over?" "Well," said I, "I've told everybody before, and they just went away and left us. Poor boy, we are sorry for you, but we don't want the smallpox, you see. Look here, I'll tell you what to do. Don't you try to land by yourself. You float along down about 20 miles, and you'll come to a town on the left side of the river. It will be long after sunrise then, and when you ask for help you tell them your folks have a fever. Don't be a fool again and let people guess what is the matter. Now we're trying to do you a kindness, so you just put 20 miles between us, that's a good boy. It wouldn't do any good to land there where the light is, it's only a wood yard. Here, I'll put a $20 gold piece on this board, and you get it when it floats by. I'm sorry to leave you, but it won't do to have smallpox, don't you see?" "Hold on, Parker," said the other man, "here's a 20 to put on the board for me. Goodbye, boy, you do as Mr. Parker told you, and you'll be all right." "That's so, my boy, goodbye, goodbye. If you see any runaway niggers, and you help catch them, you can make some money by it." "Goodbye, sir," said I. "I won't let any runaway niggers get by me." They went off and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low, because I knew very well I had done wrong. Then I thought a minute and said to myself, suppose you'd done right and given Jim up, would you feel better than what you do now? "No," said I, "I'd feel bad, I'd feel just the same way I do now." I went into the hut. Jim wasn't there. I looked all around. He wasn't anywhere. I said, "Jim. Here I am, Huck. Are they out of sight yet? Don't talk loud." He was in the river. I told him they were out of sight, so he came aboard. He said, "I was listening to all the talk, and I slipped into the river when they were coming." "Oh, how you did fool them, Huck. That was smart. I tell you, child, I expect it has saved old Jim. Old Jim isn't going to forget you for that, honey." Then we talked about the money. It was a lot of money, $20 each. Jim said we could take a steamboat now, and the money would last us as far as we wanted to go in the Free States. He said 20 miles more wasn't far for the raft to go, but he wished we were already there. Towards daybreak we tied up, and Jim worked all day getting things ready to quit rafting. That night about 10 we caught sight of the lights of a town away down on the left. I went off in the canoe to ask about it. Pretty soon I found a man out in the river with a boat, catching fish. I said, "Sir, is that town Cairo?" "Cairo? No. You must be a fool. What town is it, sir? If you want to know, go and find out. If you stay here bothering around me for about a half a minute longer, you'll get something you won't want." I returned to the raft. Jim was very disappointed, but I said never mind, Cairo would be the next place, I supposed. We passed another town before daylight, and I was going out again, but it was high ground, so I didn't go. "No high ground about Cairo," Jim said. I had forgotten it. When it was daylight, we saw the clear Ohio water. So it was all up with Cairo. We talked it all over. There wasn't any way but to wait for dark and start back in the canoe and take the chances. So we slept all day among the bushes so as to be fresh for the work, and when we went back to the raft about dark the canoe was gone. We talked about what we had better do and found there wasn't any way but just to go along down with the raft till we got a chance to buy a canoe to go back in. So we started out after dark on the raft. The night got gray and rather thick because of the fog. You couldn't tell the shape of the river and you couldn't see any distance. It was very late and still, and then along came a steamboat up the river. We lit the lantern and judged she would see it. We could hear her coming along, but we didn't see her clearly till she was close. She aimed right for us. She was a big one, and she was coming in a hurry, too, looking like a black cloud. Jim jumped into the water from one side and I from the other. The steamboat hit the raft and broke it into pieces. I dived and stayed under a minute and a half. When I came out of the water, the steamboat was out of sight in the thick fog, though I could hear her. I called out for Jim about a dozen times, but I didn't get any answer, so I swam for shore. It took me a long time to swim to the shore. I made a safe landing and climbed up the bank. I went along the rough ground for a quarter of a mile or more, and then I came across a big log house before I noticed it. I was going to rush by and get away, but a lot of dogs jumped out and began barking at me, and I stopped. Chapter 12. Meeting Jim again. In about a minute, somebody spoke out of a window without putting his head out. "Who's there?" I said, "George Jackson, sir." "What do you want?" "I don't want anything, sir. I only want to go by, but the dogs won't let me." "Why are you around here this time of night?" "I fell off the steamboat, sir." "Well, that may be so. Now, come in, George Jackson." I pushed the door a little and went in. 3 big men pointed their guns at me. The oldest was gray and about 60, and the other 2 were 30 or more. All of them were fine and handsome. There was also a sweet old gray-headed lady, and behind her there were 2 young women whom I couldn't see well. As soon as I was in, the old gentleman locked the door. Then he said he hoped I wouldn't mind being searched for arms, because he didn't mean any harm by it, it was only to make sure. He didn't look into my pockets, but only felt outside with his hands and said it was all right. He told me to make myself easy and at home and tell all about myself, but the old lady said, "Why, Saul, the poor thing's wet, and don't you suppose he may be hungry?" "Yes, Rachel, I forgot." So the old lady said, "Betsy, this was a nigger woman, you get him something to eat as quickly as you can, poor thing." And one of you girls go and wake up Buck and tell him, oh, here he is himself. Buck, take this little stranger and get the wet clothes off from him and dress him up in some of yours that's dry. Buck looked about as old as me, though he was a little bigger than me. When we got upstairs to his room he got me a shirt and pants of his, and I put them on. Buck and his ma and all of them smoked, except the nigger woman and the 2 young women. They all smoked and talked, and I ate and talked. They all asked me questions, and I told them all my family were dead. So they said I could have a home there as long as I wanted it. Then it was almost daylight, and everybody went to bed, and I went to bed with Buck, and when I woke up in the morning, I had forgotten what my name was. So I lay there about an hour trying to think, and when Buck woke up I said, "Can you spell, Buck?" "Yes," he said. "I bet you can't spell my name," said I. "Georgejackson. There now," he said. "Well," said I, "you have done it, but I didn't think you could. It isn't easy to spell." It was a very nice family, and a very nice house too. Most of the rooms had carpets on the floors, and the whole house was whitewashed on the outside. Nothing could be better. I stayed there for several days and enjoyed it. About an hour after dinner one day, everybody was taking a nap around, some in their chairs and some in their rooms. I went off down to the river, and pretty soon, I noticed that a nigger of the house was following along behind. When we were out of sight of the house he looked back and around a second, and then came running, and said, "Master George, if you'll come down into the swamp I'll show you something." So I said, "All right, go ahead." I followed a half mile, then he went into the swamp and walked as much as another half mile. We came to a little flat piece of land which was dry and very thick with trees and bushes, and he said, "You push right in there just a few steps, Master George. That's where it is." Then he went away, and pretty soon the trees hid him. I pushed my way through the trees and came to a little open place as big as a bedroom with vines around and found a man lying there asleep and, oh, it was my old Jim. I woke him up, and I supposed it was going to be a great surprise to him to see me again, but it wasn't. He nearly cried. He was so glad, but he wasn't surprised. He said he swam along behind me that night and heard me call every time, but did not dare to answer because he didn't want anybody to pick him up and take him into slavery again. He said, "I got hurt a little and couldn't swim fast, so I was a long way behind you. When you landed I supposed I could catch up with you on the land without having to shout at you, but when I saw that house I began to go slow. I was too far away to hear what they said to you. I was afraid of the dogs, but when it was all quiet again I knew you were in the house, so I went into the woods to wait for days. Early in the morning some of the niggers came along, going to the fields, and they took me and showed me this place. The dogs can't track me because of the water, and they bring me things to eat every night and tell me how you're getting along. Why didn't you tell him to fetch me here sooner, Jim?" "Well, it wasn't any use to disturb you, Huck, till we could do something. But we're all right now. I have been buying pots and pans and food when I have a chance and fixing up the raft at night when—" "What raft, Jim?" "Our old raft." "You mean to say our old raft wasn't broken to pieces?" "No, she wasn't. She was torn up a good deal, one end of her was, but there wasn't any great harm done. Now she's all fixed up again and is almost as good as new." "Why, how did you get hold of the raft again, Jim? Did you catch her?" "No, some of the niggers found her here, and they hid her in among the trees. They were talking about which of them she belonged to when I came here. I told them she didn't belong to any of them, but to you and me. Then I gave them 10 cents each, and they were very well satisfied. They're very good to me, and whatever I want them to do for me I don't have to ask them twice. That Jack's a good nigger and pretty smart." We waited there until it was dark. Then we started out as fast as we could. I never felt easy till the raft was 2 miles below there and out in the middle of the Mississippi. Then we hung up our signal lantern and judged that we were free and safe once more. I was very hungry, so Jim got out some cakes and milk, and while I ate my supper we talked and had a good time. I was extremely glad to get away from the house, and so was Jim, to get away from the swamp. We said there wasn't any home like a raft, after all. You feel very free and easy and comfortable on a raft. Chapter 13. The Duke and the King. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. Here is how we passed the time. It was a big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We ran at night and hid in the daytime. As soon as night was almost gone, we stopped and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a sandbar. Then we cut young trees and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the fishing lines. Next we slid into the river and had a swim so as to cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom, where the water was about knee-deep, and watched the daylight come. A little smoke couldn't be noticed now, so we would take some fish off the lines and cook up a hot breakfast. And afterwards we would watch the lonely river and by go to sleep. Once there was a thick fog, and the rafts and things that went by were beating tin pans so the steamboats wouldn't run over them. As soon as it was night, we started out. When we got the raft out to about the middle, we let her alone and let her float wherever the current wanted her to. Then we lit the pipes and hung our legs in the water and talked about all kinds of things. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for a long time. There were the banks and the islands across the water and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window. Sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, on a raft or a boat, and maybe you could hear a song coming over from one of the steamboats. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there with stars, and we used to lie on our backs and look up at them and talk about them. After midnight the people on shore went to bed, and then for 2 or 3 hours the shores were black. No more sparks in the cabin windows. These sparks were our clock. The first one that showed again meant morning was coming, so we hunted a place to hide and tie up right away. One morning about daybreak I found a canoe and crossed over to the main shore. It was only 200 yards to see if I could get some berries. Then, I saw 2 men running over to me. They begged me to save their lives. They said they hadn't been doing anything, and there were men and dogs coming after them. I let them get in the canoe, and then I started out for our sandbar. In about 5 or 10 minutes we heard the dogs and the men away off, shouting. We couldn't see them. They seemed to stop and look around a while. As we got further and further away all the time, we couldn't hear them at all. By the time we were 1 mile away, everything was quiet. We paddled over to the sandbar, hid in the trees, and were safe. One of these fellows was about 70. The other fellow was about 30. Both of them were dressed in old dirty clothes. After breakfast we sat around and talked. Then I learned that these men didn't know one another. Then the young man said, let me tell you about the secret of my birth. The secret of your birth. Do you mean to say, said the old man. Gentlemen, said the young man, very seriously, I will tell my secret to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights I am a duke. Jim's eyes opened wide when he heard that. Then the old man said, no. You can't mean it? Yes. My great-grandfather was the eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater. He fled to this country about the end of the last century to find freedom. He married here and died, leaving a baby. His own father died about the same time. The second son of the late Duke took everything and made himself the Duke of Bridgewater. The real baby Duke did not know this. I am the grandson of that baby, so I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater. Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. We tried to comfort him, but he said it wasn't much use. He said if we would acknowledge him, that would do him more good than almost anything else. So we said we would, if he would tell us how. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him and say my lord or simply Bridgewater. And one of us ought to wait on him at dinner and do any little thing for him he wanted. Well, that was all easy, so we did it. All through dinner Jim stood around and waited on him. This made him very pleased. But the old man didn't have much to say. He didn't look happy. So, in the afternoon, he said, look here, Bridgewater. I'm sorry for you, but you aren't the only person that's had troubles like that. And he began to cry. What do you mean? Gentlemen, I'm actually the first son of the King of France. You see before you, in dirty clothes, the wandering and suffering rightful king of France. Jim and I were so sorry and so glad and proud we'd got him with us too. So now we tried to comfort him, as we did the Duke. But he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people got down on one knee to speak to him, and always called him Your Majesty and waited on him first at meals and didn't sit down till he asked them. So Jim and I did this and that for him and stood up till he told us we might sit down. This made him cheerful and comfortable. And we were very glad too, because it would have been hard not to have any friendship on the raft. What you want on a raft, above all, is for everybody to be satisfied and to feel good about everyone else. It didn't take me long to decide that these two men were not any kings nor dukes at all. They were just cheats. But I never said anything to Jim. I kept it to myself. It's the best way. Then you don't have any quarrels and don't get into any trouble. If I learned anything from Pap, it was that the best way to get along with people like them is to let them have their way. Chapter 14. The Duke is a printer. They asked us many questions. They wanted to know why we covered up the raft that way and rested in the daytime instead of running. Was Jim a runaway nigger? I said, my family were living in Pike County, in Missouri, where I was born. They all died except Pa, my brother Ike and me. Pa decided to go and live with Uncle Ben. Ben has got a small place on the river, 44 miles below Orleans. Pa was pretty poor and had some debts. So when he had paid off the debts, there wasn't anything left but $16 and our nigger, Jim. That wasn't enough for us to go 1,400 miles by ship or any other way. Well, when the river rose, Pa was lucky to catch this raft, so we supposed we'd go down to Orleans on it. However, a steamboat ran over the raft one night and we all fell into the river. Jim and I came up all right, but Pa was drunk and Ike was only 4 years old, so they never came up anymore. Well, for the next few days we had much trouble because people were always coming out in boats and trying to take Jim away from me, saying they believed he was a runaway nigger. We don't run during the day now. They don't bother us at night. The Duke said. Let me think of a way so we can run in the daytime if we want to. We'll let it alone for today because of course we don't want to go by that town there in daylight. Towards night it began to grow dark and look like rain. We got away as soon as it was good and dark. We passed by a town shortly after. When we were 3/4 of a mile below the town, we held up our signal lantern. At about 10 o'clock, it began to rain heavily, so the king told us to both stay on watch till the weather got better, then he and the Duke got into the hut for the night. It was my watch below till 12. The wind screamed along. The waves almost washed me off the raft sometimes, but I hadn't any clothes on and didn't mind. I had the middle watch, you know, but I was pretty sleepy by that time, so Jim said he would stand the first half of it for me. He was always very good that way. There was no room in the hut for me, so I lay outside. I didn't mind the rain because it was warm and the waves weren't running so high now. About 2, the waves came up again, though. Jim was going to call me, but he changed his mind because he supposed they weren't high enough yet to do any harm. But he was mistaken about that, for pretty soon all of a sudden along came a strong wave and washed me into the river. Jim couldn't help laughing. I took the watch and Jim lay down and fell asleep. By and by the storm stopped. When the first cabin light showed, I woke him up and we slid the raft into a hiding place for the day. There was a little town about 3 miles down, and after dinner the Duke said he had thought out his idea about how to run in daylight without any danger for Jim. So he said he would go down to the town and fix that thing. The king said he would go too. We were out of coffee, so Jim said I'd better go along with them in the canoe and get some. When we got to the town, there wasn't anybody in the streets. We found a sick nigger in a backyard, and he said everybody that wasn't too young or too sick or too old had gone to camp meeting about 2 miles back in the woods. The king said he'd go to the camp meeting, and I might go too. The Duke said what he was after was a printing office because he was now a printer himself. We found it up over a carpenter shop The carpenters and printers had all gone to the meeting, and no doors were locked. It was a dirty place. It had ink marks and handbills with pictures of horses and runaway niggers on them, all over the walls. The Duke took off his coat and said he was all right now. So the king and I started out for the camp meeting. We got there in about half an hour. There were as many as 1,000 people there from 20 miles around. The preaching was going on under big sheds. The preachers had high platforms to stand on at one end of the sheds. In the first shed we came to, the preacher was reading a hymn. Then he began to preach, but you couldn't make out what he said anymore because the people had begun shouting and crying. Well, the king got into the shed, and you could hear him over everybody. Next he ran upon the platform. The preacher begged him to speak to the people, and he did it. He told them he was a pirate. He had been a pirate for 30 years out in the Indian Ocean. He lost most of his crew last spring in a fight, and he was home now to take out some new men. He'd been robbed last night and was without a cent, and he was glad of it. It was the best thing that ever happened to him because he was a changed man now. He was happy for the first time in his life. And, poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean. He would spend the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path. He could do it better than anybody else because he knew all pirate crews in that ocean, and though it would take him a long time to get there without money, he would get there anyway. And every time he persuaded a pirate he would say to him, "Don't you thank me. It all belongs to the dear people in Pokeville camp meeting and that dear preacher there, the truest friend a pirate ever had." And then he burst into tears, and so did everybody. Then people began to collect money for him. When we got back to the raft, he found he had collected $87.75. And then he had brought a jug of whiskey, too, that he found under a wagon when he was starting home through the woods. The Duke had printed off 2 little jobs for farmers in that printing office, horse bills, and took the money, $4. Then he showed us another little thing he'd printed, and it was for us. It had a picture of a runaway nigger with $200 reward under it. It was all about Jim. It said he ran away from St. Jacques Farm, 40 miles below New Orleans, last winter and likely went north. Whoever would catch him and send him back could have the reward. Now, said the Duke, after tonight we can run in the daytime if we want to. Whenever we see anybody coming we can tie Jim up with a rope and show this handbill and say we captured him up the river and we're too poor to travel on a steamboat. So we borrowed this little raft from our friends and are going down to get the reward. We all said the Duke was pretty smart and there couldn't be any trouble about running daytimes. We didn't start out till nearly 10 o'clock and we didn't hang our lantern till we were out of sight of the town. When Jim called me to take the watch at 4 in the morning, he said, "Huck, do you suppose we're going to run across any more kings on this trip?" "No," I said, "I suppose not." "Well," said he, "that's all right, then. I don't mind 1 or 2 kings, but that's enough. This one's rather drunk, and the Duke isn't much better." I found Jim had been trying to get the king to talk French so he could hear what it was like, but he said he had been in this country so long and had so much trouble, he'd forgotten it. Chapter 15. Sad story of a family. When I woke up at daybreak one morning, Jim was sitting there with his head down between his knees, sighing to himself. I knew what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children, and he was homesick because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life. I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white people do for theirs. Next day, towards night, we stopped under a little willow sandbar out in the middle, where there was a village on each side of the river. The Duke and the King began to make a plan for getting money in the towns. Jim spoke to the Duke and said he hoped it would take only a few hours because it got very tiresome to him when he had to lie all day in the hut tied with the rope. You see, when we left him all alone we had to tie him. If anybody happened to see him all by himself and not tied, it wouldn't look much like he was a runaway nigger, you know. So the Duke said he'd think out some way to get around it. The Duke was unusually bright, and he soon had an idea. He dressed Jim up in a long gown and a white horsehair wig and whiskers. Then he painted Jim's face, hands, ears and neck all blue. This made him look most frightening. Then the Duke wrote out a sign on a board. "Sick Arab, but harmless when not out of his head." And he placed that sign 4 or 5 feet in front of the hut. Jim was satisfied. He said it was better than lying tied for hours every day and trembling all over every time there was a sound. The Duke told him to make himself free and easy, and if anybody ever came around, he must jump out of the hut and cry like a wild beast, and he supposed they would leave him alone. These frauds couldn't decide what to do. The king thought he would drop over to one of the villages without any plan. We had all bought store clothes where we stopped last, and now the king put his on, and he told me to put mine on. I did it, of course. I never knew how clothes could change a body before. Now, he looked like a kind gentleman. Jim cleaned up the canoe, and I got my paddle ready. There was a big steamboat lying at the shore about 3 miles above the town. The king said, "Since I'm dressed so nicely, I suppose maybe I'd better say I come from St. Louis or Cincinnati or some other big place. Go for the steamboat, Huckleberry, we'll come down to the village on her." Pretty soon we came to a nice-looking young countryman sitting on a log, wiping the sweat off his face. He had a couple of big carpetbags by him. "Where are you going, young man?" said the king. "To Orleans." "I will take that steamboat." "Get aboard," said the king. "Wait a minute, my servant will help you with the bags." "Jump out and help the gentleman, Adolphus," meaning me, I realized. I did so, and then we 3 started on again. The young man was very thankful. He said it was tough work taking his baggage in such weather. He asked the king where he was going, and the king told him he'd come down the river and landed at the other village this morning, and now he was going up a few miles to see an old friend on a farm up there. The young fellow said, "When I first saw you, I said to myself, it's Mr. Wilkes, sure, and he's come here almost in time. But then I said again, no, I suppose it isn't him, or else he wouldn't be paddling up the river. You aren't him, are you?" "No, my name's Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett, Minister Alexander Blodgett. I suppose I must say I'm one of the Lord's poor servants. But still I'm just sorry for Mr. Wilkes for not arriving in time, if he's missed anything because of it, which I hope he hasn't. Well, he won't miss any property by it, because he'll get that all right. But he's missed seeing his brother Peter die. His brother would have given anything in this world to see him before he died. His brother never talked about anything else all these 3 weeks. He hadn't seen him since they were boys together. He hadn't ever seen his brother William at all, that's the deaf and dumb one. William isn't more than 30 or 35. Peter and George were the only ones that came out here. George was the married brother. He and his wife both died last year. Harvey and William are the only ones left now. And, as I was saying, they haven't got here in time. Did anybody send them word? Oh, yes, a month or 2 ago, when Peter first fell ill, because Peter said then that he felt like he wasn't going to get well this time. You see, he was pretty old, and George's girls were too young to be much company for him, except Mary Jane, the red-headed one. So he was lonely after George and his wife died, and didn't seem to care much to live. He wanted very much to see Harvey, and William too. He left a letter behind for Harvey, and said he'd told in it where his money was hidden, and how he wanted the rest of the property divided up, so George's girls would be all right, for George didn't leave anything. Why do you suppose Harvey hasn't come? Where does he live? Oh, he lives in Sheffield, England. He preaches there. He hasn't ever been in this country. He hasn't had too much time, and besides he might not have got the letter at all, you know. Too bad he couldn't see his brothers, poor man. You're going to Orleans, you say? Yes, but that is only a part of it. I'm going in a ship next Wednesday for Brazil, where my uncle lives. It's a pretty long journey. But it'll be lovely. I wish I were going. Is Mary Jane the oldest? How old are the others? Mary Jane's 19, Susan's 15, and Joanna's about 14, that's the one that has a hair lip. Poor things. to be left alone in the cold world so. Well, they could be worse off. Old Peter had friends, and they aren't going to let them come to any harm. Well, there are a lot of them. Peter used to write about them sometimes when he wrote home, so Harvey will know where to look for friends when he gets here. Well, the old man went on asking questions till that young fellow told him about everybody and everything in that town. Was Peter Wilkes well off? Oh, yes, pretty well off. He had houses and land, and it's supposed he left 3 or 4,000 in cash hidden up somewhere. When did you say he died? I didn't say, but it was last night. Funeral tomorrow, likely? Yes, about the middle of the day. When we reached the boat she had almost finished loading, and pretty soon she got off. When the boat was gone the king made me paddle up another mile to a lonely place, and then he got on land and said, "Now hurry back at once and fetch the Duke up here and the new carpet bags." I saw what he was up to, but I never said anything, of course. When I got back with the Duke we hid the canoe, then they sat down on a log, and the king told him everything. And all the time he was doing it, he tried to talk like an Englishman, and he did it pretty well. Then he said, "How are you at playing the deaf and dumb, Bridgewater?" The Duke said he had played a deaf and dumb person in a play. So then they waited for a steamboat. About the middle of the afternoon a big steamboat came, and they called to her. We went aboard, and she was from Cincinnati. When they found we only wanted to go 4 or 5 miles, they were angry and said they wouldn't land us. But the king was calm. He gave them $5 and they became soft and said it was all right. And when we got to the village they sent us on land. About 24 men in the town gathered down to the river when they saw us coming. The king said, "Can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" They looked at one another and nodded their heads. Then one of them said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can only tell you where he did live yesterday evening." Suddenly, the old man began to cry sadly and said, "Alas, our poor brother, gone, and we never saw him. Oh, it's too hard." Then he turned around, crying, and made a lot of foolish signs to the Duke. At once, the Duke dropped a carpet bag and burst out crying. Well, the men gathered around and said all sorts of kind things to them. They told the king all about his brother's last moments, and the king repeated it to the Duke using his hands. And both of them pretended to be so sad that it made me ashamed of the human race. Chapter 16. A Bad Investment. The news was all over town in 2 minutes, and you could see the people running up from every way, some of them putting on their coats as they came. When we got to the house, the street in front of it was packed, and the 3 girls were standing in the door. Mary Jane was red-headed. She was very beautiful, and her face and her eyes were all lit up. She was so glad her uncles had come. The king spread his arms, and Mary Jane jumped for them, and the one with a hare lip jumped for the Duke. Everybody almost, at least women, cried for joy to see them meet again at last and have such good times. Then the king looked around and saw the coffin in the corner on 2 chairs, so he and the Duke walked slowly over there. Then they bent over and looked in the coffin, and then they burst out crying for 3 minutes, or maybe 4. And everybody was crying, too. Well, by and by, the king got up and came forward a little and made out a speech, full of tears, about not seeing his brother alive after the long journey of 4,000 miles. Then he started crying again. Next, the king said how he and his nieces would be glad if a few of the friends of the family would take supper here with them this evening and help with the ashes of his brother. So the friends all came and shook hands with the king, thanked him and talked to him. Then they shook hands with the Duke. Then Mary Jane fetched the letter her father left behind, and the king read it out loud and cried over it. It gave the dwelling house and $3,000, gold, to the girls, and it gave the tan yard, which was doing a good business, along with some other houses and land, worth about $7,000, and $3,000 in gold to Harvey and William, and told where the $6,000 was hidden down in the cellar. So these 2 frauds said they'd go and fetch it up, and told me to come with a candle. When we got back upstairs, everybody gathered around the table, and the king counted the money. Then they put it into the bag again. I saw the king getting ready for another speech. He spoke of how generous his poor brother had been. Then he asked the duke if he agreed to give all the money to the girls. He turned around and began to make a lot of signs to the duke with his hands, and the duke looked at him for a while, then all of a sudden he seemed to catch his meaning. He jumped for the king and hugged him about 15 times before he stopped. Then the king said, "I knew it. I suppose that'll convince anybody the way he feels about it. Here, Mary Jane, Susan, Joanna, take the money, take it all. It's the gift of him that is lying there, cold but joyful." Mary Jane went for him. Susan and the hare lip went for the duke, and then another hugging and kissing. And everybody crowded up with the tears in their eyes and almost shook the hands off the frauds, saying all the time, "You dear good people. How lovely. How could you?" Before long a big man came in from outside and stood listening and looking and not saying anything. Nobody said anything to him either because the king was talking and they were all busy listening. While the king was speaking of the funeral, the big man laughed right in his face. Everybody was shocked. One man said, "Why, Dr. Robinson, haven't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes." The king smiled eagerly and said, "Is this my poor brother's dear good friend and doctor?" You talk like an Englishman, don't you?" said the doctor. "It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You Peter Wilkes' brother. You're a fraud, that's what you are." The people gathered around the doctor and tried to explain to him and tell him how Harvey had shown in many ways that he was Harvey. They said Harvey knew everybody by name, even the names of the dogs. They begged him not to hurt Harvey's feelings and the poor girl's feelings. The poor girls were crying, and the doctor said to them, "I was your father's friend, and I'm your friend. I warn you as a friend to turn your backs on that fraud and not to have anything to do with him. He has come here with a lot of empty names and facts that he picked up somewhere. Mary Jane Wilkes, listen to me, turn this fraud out, I beg you to do it. Will you?" Mary Jane straightened herself up, and but she was handsome. She said, "Here is my answer." She picked up the bag of money and put it in the king's hands and said, "Take this $6,000 and invest for me and my sisters any way you want to, and don't give us any receipt for it." Then she put her arm around the king on one side, and Susan and the hare lip did the same on the other. Everybody clapped their hands while the king held up his head and smiled proudly. The doctor said, "All right, I wash my hands off the matter. But I warn you all that you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day." And away he went. Chapter 17. Huck takes the money. Well, when they were all gone the king asked Mary Jane if they had spare rooms, and she said she had one spare room for Uncle William, and she'd give her own room to Uncle Harvey. She would sleep in the room of her sisters. There was a small room in the attic with a small bed in it. The king said it would do for his servant, meaning me. So Mary Jane took us up and she showed them their rooms. That night they had a big supper and all the men and women were there. I stood behind the king and the duke's chairs and waited on them, and the niggers waited on the rest. After that, the hare lip and I had supper in the kitchen, while the others were helping the niggers clean up the things. The hare lip started asking me about England. I didn't do it pretty well. Then Mary Jane and Susan stepped into the kitchen. I said to myself, these are the girls that I'm letting that old fraud rob of their money. My mind is made up, I'll hide that money for them. When I was alone, I began thinking the thing over. I said to myself, shall I go to that doctor and tell on these frauds? No, that won't do. He might tell who told him, then the king and the duke would hate me. Shall I tell Mary Jane? No, I dare not do it. She would show it, they've got the money, and they'd slide right out and get away with it. There is only one good way. I have to steal that money. I will steal it and hide it, and when I'm away down the river, I'll write a letter and tell Mary Jane where it is hidden. But I'd better do it tonight if I can, because maybe the doctor will drive them out of here. So, I thought, I'll go and search the rooms. Upstairs the hall was dark, but I went to the king's room and began to feel around there. Just at that time I heard their footsteps coming. I jumped behind the curtain and stood there perfectly still. They came in and shut the door, and the first thing the Duke did was to get down and look under the bed. They sat down then, and the king said, "Well, what is it?" and cut it short. "We must get down quickly. We shouldn't give them a chance to talk us over. Well, it makes me uncomfortable to think of the doctor. We'd better get out of this before 3 in the morning and go down the river with what we've got." "What? And not sell out the rest of the property?" The Duke said the bag of gold was enough, and he didn't want to rob the orphans of everything they had. "Why, how you talk," said the king. "We shan't rob them of anything at all but just this money. The people that buy the property are the sufferers, because as soon as it's found out that we didn't own it, the sale won't be valid and it'll all go back to the girls. These young orphans will get their house back again, and that's enough for them. They're young and can easily earn a living. They aren't going to suffer." At last the Duke gave in and said all right. So they got ready to go down again. The Duke said, "I don't think we put that money in a good place." The king began feeling under the curtain 2 or 3 feet from where I was. I stuck tight to the wall and kept very still. The king got the bag and pushed it through some straw under the bed. And I had it before they were halfway downstairs. I felt my way up to my room and hid it there till I could get a chance to do better. I judged I'd better hide it outside of the house somewhere, because if they missed it, they would search the house. Then I went to bed with my clothes all on, but I couldn't fall asleep. By and by I heard the king and the Duke come up, so I rolled off my bed and waited to see if anything was going to happen. But nothing did. So I held on till everything was still, and then I slipped down the ladder. Chapter 18. A good place for the money. I crept to their doors and listened. They were snoring. So I tiptoed along and got downstairs all right. There wasn't a sound anywhere. I looked through an opening in the dining room door and saw the men watching the corpse all sound asleep on their chairs. The door was open into the living room, and there was a candle in both rooms. I passed along, and the living room door was open, but I saw there wasn't anybody in there. So I walked on, but the front door was locked, and the key wasn't there. Just then I heard somebody coming down the stairs, back behind me. I ran in the living room and took a quick look around, and the only place I saw to hide the bag was in the coffin. I put the money bag in under the lid, just down where his hands were crossed. Then I ran back across the room and hid behind the door. The person coming was Mary Jane. She went to the coffin very softly and kneeled down. Then she began to cry, though I couldn't hear her, and her back was to me. I slid out, and as I passed the dining room, everything was all right and the watchers hadn't moved. I slipped up to bed. I was afraid the money would be found when they came to screw on the lid. Of course I wanted to slide down and get it out of there, but I was afraid I might get caught. When I got downstairs in the morning, the living room was shut up and the watchers were gone. There wasn't anybody around but the family and the 3 of us. I watched their faces to see if anything had been happening, but I couldn't tell. Towards the middle of the day the undertaker came with his man, and they set the coffin in the middle of the room on a couple of chairs. I saw the coffin lid was the way it was before, but I dared not go to look in under it, with folks around. When the funeral sermon was over, the undertaker screwed the coffin down tight and fast. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. They buried him, and we came back home. I began watching faces again, but the faces didn't tell me anything. The king visited the villagers in the evening, and he told them he had to hurry and settle up the estate right away and leave for home. He was very sorry he was in such a hurry, and so was everybody. They wished he could stay longer. And he said, of course he and William would take the girls home with them, and it pleased the girls. The poor things were so glad and happy that it made my heart ache to see them getting fooled and lied to so, but I didn't see any safe way for me to help them. The next day after the funeral, at about noontime, a couple of nigger traders came along, and the king sold them the niggers. The 2 sons were sold up the river to Memphis and their mother down the river to Orleans. They would come to get them in 3 days. The poor girls and the niggers cried around each other, and it made me sick to see it. The girls said they hadn't ever dreamed of seeing the family separated or sold away from the town. The next day was auction day. Early in the morning, the king and the duke came up in the attic and woke me up, and I saw by their look that there was trouble. The king said, "Were you in my room the night before last?" "No, your majesty." That was the way I always called him when nobody was around. "Were you in there yesterday or last night?" "No, your majesty." The duke said, "Have you seen anybody else go in there?" "No, I believe." Stop and think. I thought for a while and saw my chance, and then I said, "Well, I saw the niggers go in there several times." Both of them gave a little jump. Then the duke said, "What, all of them?" "No, not all at once." "Hello. When was that?" "It was the day we had the funeral." "In the morning." "It wasn't early, because I got up late. I was just starting down the ladder, and I saw them." "Well, go on, go on. What did they do? How did they act?" "They didn't do anything. They tiptoed away. I thought that they'd got in there to do up your majesty's room. I thought they were hoping to slide out without waking you up." Both of them looked pretty sick and silly. "Has something gone wrong?" I asked. The king turned on me and cried out, "It's none of your business." Then he said to the duke, "We have to say nothing about it." Chapter 19. Huck tells the truth. Soon, it was time to get up. So I came down the ladder and started to go downstairs, but as I came to the girls' room the door was open. I saw Mary Jane packing things, getting ready to go to England. But she had stopped now and had her face in her hands, crying. I went in there and said, "Miss Mary Jane, you can't bear to see people in trouble, and I can't. Tell me about it." So she did it. And it was the niggers, I just expected it. She said she didn't know how she was ever going to be happy in England, knowing the mother and the children weren't ever going to see each other anymore. Then she burst into tears and said, "Oh, dear, dear, to think they aren't going to see each other anymore." "But they will, within 2 weeks, and I know it," said I. At once, she threw her arms around my neck and told me to say it again. I saw I had spoken too suddenly and said too much. I asked her to let me think a minute. Then I said, "Miss Mary Jane, is there any place out of town where you could go and stay 3 or 4 days?" "Yes, Mr. Lothrop's." "Why?" "Never mind why yet. If I tell you how I know the niggers will see each other again within 2 weeks here in this house, and prove how I know it, will you go to Mr. Lothrop's and stay 4 days?" "4 days?" she said. "I'll stay a year." I shut the door, sat down again and said, "Don't shout. Just sit still and take it like a man. I have to tell the truth, Miss Mary. It's something bad. These uncles of yours aren't any uncles at all. They're frauds." I went right along and told her everything. Her face turned red like sunset and said, "You tell me what to do, and whatever you say I'll do it." I said, "Miss Mary Jane, I'll tell you what we'll do, and you won't have to stay at Mr. Lothrop's so long either." "How far is it?" "A little less than 4 miles. "Well, that will do. Now you go there and stay till 9 or 9:30 tonight. Then get them to fetch you home again. Tell them you've thought of something. If you get here before 11, put a candle in this window, and if I don't turn up it means I'm gone and safe. Then you come out and spread the news around and get these frauds jailed." "Good," she said, "I'll do it. Well, I'll run down to breakfast now, and then I'll start straight for Mr. Lothrop's." "No, Miss Mary Jane," I said, "go before breakfast." "Why? What did you suppose I wanted you to go for, Miss Mary?" "Well, I don't know. What was it?" "Why, do you suppose you can go and face your uncles when they come to kiss you good morning and never, there, don't." "Yes, I'll go before breakfast." "And leave my sisters with them?" "Yes, never mind about them. I don't want you to see them, nor your sisters, nor anybody in this town. If a neighbor were to ask how your uncles are this morning, your face would tell something. No, you go right along, Miss Mary Jane, and I'll fix it with all of them." I'll say you've gone away for a few hours to get a little rest and change, or to see a friend, and you'll be back tonight or early in the morning." Then I added, "There's one more thing, that bag of money. Well, they've got that, and it makes me feel pretty silly to think how they got it." "No, they haven't got it." "Why, who's got it?" "I wish I knew, but I don't. I had it because I stole it from them. I stole it to give to you, and I know where I hid it, but I'm afraid it isn't there anymore. I'm terribly sorry, Miss Mary Jane, but I did the best I could. I was almost caught, and I had to put it into the first place I came to, and ran. And it wasn't a good place." "Oh, stop blaming yourself. It wasn't your fault. Where did you hide it?" For a minute I didn't say anything, then I said, "I'd rather not tell you where I put it, Miss Mary Jane. But I'll write it for you on a piece of paper, and you can read it along the road to Mr. Lothrop's. Do you suppose that'll do?" "Oh, yes." So I wrote, "I put it in the coffin. It was in there when you were crying there, away in the night. I was behind the door, and I was very sorry for you, Miss Mary Jane." When I folded it up and gave it to her, I saw the water come into her eyes, and she shook me by the hand, hard, and said, "Goodbye. I'm going to do everything just as you've told me. If I don't ever see you again, I shan't ever forget you, and I'll think of you many times, and I'll pray for you, too." Well, Mary Jane went out the back way, I suppose, because nobody saw her go. When I met Susan and the hare lip, I told them Miss Mary Jane had gone over to a friend's in a hurry, one of them was sick. Well, they held the auction in the public square, along towards the end of the afternoon, and everything was sold. The king wanted to swallow everything. While they were at it, a steamboat landed, and in about 2 minutes up came a crowd of people shouting and laughing. Chapter 20. Huck escapes. They were fetching a very nice-looking old gentleman along, and a nice-looking younger one, with his right arm in a sling. The Duke remained calm. He was just happy and satisfied as ever. But the king just looked at the newcomers, as if it made him sick to think there could be such frauds in the world. Many of the people gathered around the king to let him see they were on his side. That old gentleman that had just come looked all puzzled to death. Pretty soon he began to speak, and I saw at once he pronounced like an Englishman. The old gentleman said, "My brother and I have had bad luck. He's broken his arm, and our baggage was put off at a town above here last night by mistake. I am Peter Wilkes' brother Harvey, and this is his brother William. He can't hear or speak. In a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove who we are. But up till then I won't say anything more, but go to the hotel and wait." So they started off. The king laughed, and so did everybody else, except 3 or 4, or maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor. Another one was a sharp-looking gentleman with a carpetbag who had just come off the steamboat. He was talking to the doctor in a low voice and glancing towards the king now and then. It was Levi Bell, the lawyer that had just returned from Louisville. And another one was a big man that came along and listened to what the old gentleman said. And when the king stopped laughing, this big man said, "Say, if you are Harvey Wilkes, when did you come to this town?" "The day before the funeral, friend," said the king. "But what time of the day?" "In the evening, about an hour or 2 before sundown." "How did you come?" "I came down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati." "Well, then, why were you up at the Point in the morning, in a canoe?" "I wasn't up at the Point in the morning." "It's a lie. You were up at the Point that morning." "I live up there." "Well, I was up there, and you were up there. I saw you there. You came in a canoe, along with Tim Collins and a boy." The doctor said, "Would you know the boy again if you were to see him, Hines?" "I suppose I would, but I don't know." "Why, there he is, now. I know him perfectly easily. It was me he pointed at." The doctor said, "Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple are frauds or not. But if these two aren't frauds, I am an idiot, that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here till we've looked into this thing. Come along, Hines, come along, the rest of you." We'll take these fellows to the hotel and let them see the other couple, and I suppose we'll find out something." So we all started. It was about sundown. The doctor led me along by the hand and was kind enough, but he never let go my hand. We all got in a big room in the hotel. We lit up some candles and fetched in the new couple. First, the doctor said, "I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds, and they may have partners that we don't know anything about. If they have, won't the partners get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It isn't unlikely. If these men aren't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove they're all right, isn't that so?" Everybody agreed to that. But the king only looked sad and said, "Gentlemen, the money isn't there, you can send and see if you want to." "Where is it, then?" "Well, when my niece gave it to me to keep for her, I took and hid it inside some straw under my bed. The niggers stole it the very next morning after I had gone downstairs. When I sold them, I hadn't missed the money yet, so they got clean away with it. My servant here can tell you about it, gentlemen." I could see nobody believed him. One man asked me if I saw the niggers steal it. I said no. I told them I saw them slipping out of the room and hurrying away. I supposed they were afraid they had woken up my master and were trying to get away before there was trouble. Then the doctor turned to me and said, "Are you English too?" I said yes, and he and some others laughed. They made the king tell his story, and they made the old gentleman tell his. Anybody could see that the old gentleman was telling the truth and the other one was telling lies. Then the new gentleman said, "I've thought of something. Is there anybody here that helped to bury Peter Wilkes?" "Yes," said somebody, "Ab Turner and I did it. We're both here." Then the old man turned towards the king and said, "Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast." Both of them spoke up and said, "We didn't see any mark." "Good," said the old gentleman. "Now, what you did see on his breast was a small P, a B, and a W, with dashes between them, so P, B, W. And he marked them that way on a piece of paper. Come, isn't that what you saw?" Both of them spoke up again and said, "No, we didn't. We never saw any marks at all." The lawyer jumped on the table and said, "Gentlemen, let's go and dig up the corpse and look." They caught us all and led us to the graveyard, which was 1.5 miles down the river. The whole town came after us, for it was only 9 in the evening. Well, black clouds had begun to gather, and there was lightning now and then. Hines dragged me right along. He was so excited, and I had to run to keep up. And when they got to the grave they found they had forgotten to fetch a lantern. But they started digging anyway by the lightning and sent a man to the nearest house to borrow a lantern. It got very dark, and the rain started, but the people never took any notice of it. At last they got out the coffin and began to take off the lid. Everybody crowded around to push in and get a sight. Hines hurt my wrist so much pulling it, and I suppose he forgot I was in the world. He was so excited. All of a sudden there was flash and somebody called out, "Here's the bag of gold on his breast." Hines let out a cry of surprise, like everybody else. Then he dropped my wrist and pushed his way in to get a look. So I ran away down the road in the dark. When I was far above the town, I could see the sandbar. I began to look for a boat to borrow. I found a canoe that was tied with only a rope. The sandbar was away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose any time. When I reached the raft at last, I jumped out and called out, "Out with you, Jim. Let's get away. Thank God. We've got rid of them." So in 2 seconds, we went away down the river. It seemed so good to be free again and all by ourselves on the big river, with nobody to bother us. Shortly after that, I noticed a sound that I knew very well. I held my breath and listened. Sure enough, when the next flash lit up the water, here they came. It was the king and the duke coming in a boat. I dropped onto the raft and gave up. It was all I could do to keep from crying. Chapter 21. A quarrel between the king and the duke. When they got aboard, the king came to me, shook me by the collar, and said, "You were trying to get away from us. Tired of us, hey?" I said, "No, Your Majesty, we weren't. Please don't, Your Majesty." So I told him how I got away. The king let go of me. Then, he said, "We supposed the niggers stole the money." "Yes," said the Duke, "we did." After about a half a minute the king said, "Look here, Bridgewater, what do you mean?" The Duke said, "Oh, do you take me for a fool? Don't you suppose I know who hid that money in that coffin?" "Yes, sir. I know you do know, because you did it yourself." "It's a lie." And the Duke went for him. The king cried out, "Take your hands off. Let go of my throat. I take back what I said." The Duke said, "Well, you just admit, first, that you did hide that money there, intending to come back and dig it up someday and have it all to yourself." The king cried out, "Enough. I admit." I was very glad to hear him say that. It made me feel much easier than before. So the Duke took his hands off and said, "If you ever deny it again, I'll drown you. I never saw anyone who wants to take everything. I trusted you all the time, as if you were my own father. You ought to have been ashamed of yourself." So the king got into the hut and began to drink, and before long the Duke also began to drink. They both got drunk and soon fell fast asleep. Then I told Jim everything. Chapter 22. Jim is gone. We did not dare to stop again at any town for days and days. We kept right along down the river. We were down south in the warm weather now, and a very long way from home. So now the frauds supposed they were out of danger, and they began to think of ways to get money again. They did all kinds of things, but they couldn't make much money. At last they sat together in the hut and talked in a whisper for 2 or 3 hours at a time. We thought they were going to break into somebody's house or store, or something of that kind. So we were pretty scared and made up an agreement that we wouldn't have anything at all to do with such actions. If we ever got a chance, we would get away from them. Well, early one morning, we hid the raft in a good safe place about 2 miles below a small village named Pikesville. The king went on land and told us all to stay hidden while he went up to town and looked around. And he said if he wasn't back by midday the Duke and I would know it was all right and we were to come along. So we stayed where we were. When midday came and no king, the Duke and I went up to the village and hunted around there for the king. By and by we found him in the back room of a little inn. He was so drunk that he couldn't walk. The Duke began to call him an old fool, and the king began to shout back. While they were at it, I slipped out and ran down the river road like a deer. I made up my mind that it would be a long day before they ever saw me and Jim again. I got down there all out of breath but full of joy and called out, "Let's go, Jim. We're all right now." But there wasn't any answer, and nobody came out of the hut. Jim was gone. I ran this way and that in the woods, shouting, but it wasn't any use, old Jim was gone. Then I sat down and cried. I couldn't help it. Pretty soon I went out on the road, trying to think what to do. Then I ran across a boy walking and asked him if he'd seen a strange nigger, and he said, "Yes." "Where?" said I. "Down at Silas Phelps' place, 2 miles below here. He's a runaway nigger, and they've got him." "Are you looking for him?" "I'm not. I ran across him in the woods about an hour or 2 ago, and he said if I called he'd kill me. And he told me to lie down and stay where I was, and I did it. I have been there ever since, afraid to come out." "Well," he said, "you needn't be afraid anymore, because they've got him. He ran off from down south, somewhere. It's a good job they got him." "Well, I suppose. There's a reward of $200 on him. It's like picking up money out on the road." "Yes, it is, and I could have had it if I'd been big enough. I saw him first." "Who caught him?" "It was an old fellow, a stranger, and he sold out his chance for $40 because he'd got to go up the river and couldn't wait. I saw the handbill myself. It tells all about him, with a picture of him." Then he left. I went to the raft and sat down in the hut to think. I couldn't see any way out of the trouble. After all this long journey, and after all we'd done for the frauds, it all came to nothing. Everything was ruined because they served Jim such a trick as that, and made him a slave again all his life for $40 dirty. Once I said to myself it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, if he had to be a slave. So I'd better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon gave up that idea. She'd be mad with Jim for leaving her, and so she'd sell him straight down the river again. And everybody would get to know that Huck Finn helped a nigger to get his freedom. And I would feel ashamed of it. So I was full of trouble and didn't know what to do. At last I got a piece of paper and a pencil and sat down and wrote. Miss Watson, your runaway nigger Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up if you send the reward. Huck Finn. I put the paper down and sat there thinking. I started thinking over our trip down the river, and I saw Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we floating along, talking and singing and laughing. I took up that paper and held it in my hand. I was trembling because I had to decide, forever, between 2 things, and I knew it. I studied it a minute and tore it up. I decided to steal Jim out of slavery again. At last I had a plan to do it. So as soon as it was dark enough, I crept out with my raft and went for an island down the river. I hid it there and then lay down. I slept the night through and got up before it was light. I had my breakfast and put on my store clothes. Then I tied up some others in a bundle, took the canoe and started out. I landed below where I judged was the Phelps place. I hid my bundle in the woods. Then I filled up the canoe with water and loaded rocks into her and sank her where I could find her again. When I passed a mill I saw a sign on it, Phelps Sawmill. And when I came to the farmhouses, 200 or 300 yards further along, I didn't see anybody around. But I didn't mind because I didn't want to see anybody just yet. I only wanted to take a look at the land. According to my plan, I was going to go there from the village, not from below. So I just took a look and went along, straight for town. Well, the very first man I saw when I got there was the Duke. I was right on him before I could get away. He looked astonished and said, "Hello. Where did you come from?" Then he pretended to be glad and eager and said, "Where's the raft? Have you got her in a good place?" I said, "Why, that's just what I was going to ask you." Then he didn't look so joyful and said, "What was your idea for asking me?" "Well," I said, "when I saw the king in that bar yesterday I found we couldn't get him home for hours, so I went around town to pass the time and wait. A man came up and offered me 10 cents to help him pull a boat over the river and back to fetch a sheep. So I went along. But when we were dragging the sheep to the boat, it broke loose and we ran after him. We didn't get it till dark. Then we fetched him over and I started down for the raft. When I got there and saw it was gone, I said to myself, they've got into trouble and had to leave and they've taken my nigger and now I'm in a strange country with nothing left, so I sat down and cried. I slept in the woods all night. But what happened to the raft then? And Jim, poor Jim. I don't know what's happened to the raft. That old fool sold Jim for $40, but he never divided with me, and the money's gone. Sold him? I said, and began to cry. Why, he was my nigger, and that was my money. Where is he? I want my nigger. He looked troubled and stood there thinking. At last he said, I'll tell you something. We've got to be here 3 days. If you'll promise you won't tell our secret to anybody, I'll tell you where to find him. So I promised, and he said, a farmer by the name of Silas, and then he stopped. Pretty soon he said, the man that bought him is named Abram Foster, and he lives 40 miles away from here, on the road to Lafayette. All right, I said, I can walk it in 3 days. And I'll start this very afternoon. No, you won't, you'll start now. Don't lose any time about it. Just keep your mouth shut and move right along. Then you won't get into trouble with us, do you hear? That was the order I wanted. I wanted to be left free to work my plans. So I left. I didn't look around. I went straight out in the country as much as a mile before I stopped. Then I returned through the woods towards the Phelps. I decided to start my plan at once because I wanted to stop Jim's mouth till these fellows could get away. I didn't want to have anything to do with their kind. I wanted to get away from them. Chapter 23. Huck as Tom Sawyer. When I got there it was all still and hot. The Phelps was one of these small cotton farms, and they all look alike. I went around to the back and climbed in. Then I started for the kitchen. When I got halfway, first one dog, and then another got up and went for me. Of course I stopped and faced them and kept still. Pretty soon, I was surrounded by a circle of 15 of them, barking. A nigger woman came running out of the kitchen and drove the dogs away. And behind the woman came a little nigger girl and 2 little nigger boys. Then came a white woman running from the house, about 45 or 50 years old. And behind her came her little white children. She was smiling all over and said, "It's you, at last, isn't it?" Without thinking I said, "Yes, ma'am." She hugged me and then took both my hands and shook and shook. Tears came in her eyes and ran down. She kept saying, "You don't look so much like your mother as I supposed, but I don't care for that. I'm so glad to see you. Children, it's your cousin Tom." But the children dropped their heads, put their fingers in their mouths, and hid behind her. "Did you get your breakfast on the boat?" I said I had it on the boat. So then she started for the house, leading me by the hand. When we got there she let me sit down in a broken chair, and she sat in front of me, holding both of my hands, and said, "Now I can have a good look at you. I've been expecting to see you all these long years, and it's come at last. I'm your Aunt Sally. We've been expecting you a couple of days. Your uncle's been up to the town every day to fetch you. And he's gone again, not more than an hour ago. He'll be back any minute now. You must have met him on the road, didn't you?" "No, I didn't see anybody, Aunt Sally. The boat landed just at daylight, and I left my baggage on the wharf and went looking around the town and the nearby countryside a bit. So I came down the back way." "Who did you give the baggage to?" "Nobody." "Why, child, it'll be stolen." "I hid it somewhere, and I suppose it won't," I said. I was getting so uneasy I couldn't listen well. I was thinking of the children all the time. I wanted to get them out to one side and find out who I was. But Mrs. Phelps kept on talking. Pretty soon she said, "But you haven't told me a word about my sister, nor any of them. Now just tell me all about every one of them." Well, I had to say something. I opened my mouth to begin, but she pushed me in behind the bed and said, "Here he comes. Put your head down lower. Don't let him see you now. I'll play a joke on him. Children, don't say a word." When the old gentleman came in, Mrs. Phelps said, "Has he come?" "No," said her husband. "Oh," she said, "what on earth can have happened to him?" "I can't imagine," said the old gentleman, "and I must say it makes me very uneasy." She said, "He must have come, and you've missed him along the road." "I know it's so, something tells me so." "Why, Sally, I couldn't miss him along the road. You know that." "But oh, dear, dear, what will sister say? He must have come. You must have missed him." "Oh, Sally, it's terrible. Something has happened to the boat, sure." "Why, Silas. Look there. Up the road. Isn't it somebody coming?" He jumped to the window, and that gave Mrs. Phelps the chance she wanted. She gave me a pull, and out I came. When he turned back from the window, she was smiling. The old gentleman stared and said, "Why, who's that? Who do you suppose it is?" "I haven't any idea." "Who is it?" "It's Tom Sawyer." Imagine how astonished I was. At once, the old man grabbed me by the hand and shook and kept on shaking. And all the time the woman danced around and laughed and cried. Then they both asked questions about Sid and Mary and the rest of the family. I was so pleased. It was like being born again, and I was so glad to find out who I was. Being Tom Sawyer was easy and comfortable. But soon, I heard a steamboat along down the river. Then I said to myself, suppose Tom Sawyer comes down on that boat? And suppose he steps in here any minute and calls out my name before I can stop him? Well, I must go up the road and wait for him. So I told the folks I would go up to the town and fetch down my baggage. The old gentleman wanted to go along with me, but I said no, and I'd rather he wouldn't take any trouble about me. Chapter 24. Tom Sawyer arrives. So I started for town in the wagon. When I was halfway I saw a wagon coming, and sure enough it was Tom Sawyer, and I stopped and waited till he came along. When Tom saw me, his mouth opened wide. And he swallowed 2 or 3 times and then said, "I haven't ever done you any harm. You know that. So, then, what you want to come back and hunt me for?" I said, "I haven't come back, I haven't been gone." He said, "Oh, you aren't a ghost?" "No, I'm not," I said. "Well, I can't understand it. Weren't you ever murdered?" "No. I wasn't ever murdered at all. You come in here and feel me, if you don't believe me." So he did it, and it satisfied him. He was so glad to see me again that he didn't know what to do. And he wanted to know all about it right away, because it was a grand adventure and mysterious. But I told him the kind of trouble I was in. He thought for a moment and then said, "It's all right. Take my trunk in your wagon and pretend it's yours. I'll get there a quarter or a half an hour after you." I said, "All right, but wait a minute. There's one more thing, a thing that nobody knows but me. And that is, there's a nigger here that I'm trying to steal out of slavery. His name is Jim, old Miss Watson's Jim." He said, "What? Why, Jim is..." He stopped and began thinking. Then his eyes lit up, and he said, "I'll help you steal him." Then we took the trunk and put it in my wagon. Then he drove off his way and I drove mine. Tom's wagon arrived half an hour after mine. Aunt Sally saw it through the window, because it was only about 50 yards, and said, "Why, there's somebody coming. I wonder who it is? Why, I do believe it's a stranger." "Oh, it's Sid," I said. Everybody rushed to the front door. Aunt Sally hugged him and kissed him over and over again. And after they got a little quiet again she said, "Why, dear me, I never saw such a surprise. We weren't looking for you at all, but only Tom. My sister never wrote to me about anybody coming but him. It's because it wasn't intended for any of us to come but Tom," he said, "but I begged and begged, and at the last minute she let me come too. So, when we were coming down the river, Tom and I decided to give you a surprise." There was a great deal of talk all the afternoon, but they didn't happen to say anything about any runaway nigger. But at supper, at night, one of the little boys said, "Pa, may Tom and Sid and I go to the show?" "No," said the old man, "I suppose there isn't going to be any, and you couldn't go if there were, because the runaway nigger told Burton and me all about that shocking show, and Burton said he would tell the people. So I suppose they've driven them out of town before this time." Tom and I were to sleep in the same room and bed. Right after supper, we said that we were tired. We said good night and went up to bed. Then we climbed out of the window and went to the town. I didn't believe anybody was going to give the king and the duke a message, and so if I didn't hurry up and give them one, they would surely get into trouble. On the road Tom told me all about how it was supposed I was murdered and how Pap disappeared pretty soon and didn't come back anymore and what happened when Jim ran away. I told Tom all about the king and the duke and the raft voyage. As we reached the town, we saw people rushing up angrily with torches in their hands. They kept shouting and blowing horns. We jumped to one side to let them go by, and as they went by I saw they had the king and the duke covered with tar and feathers. It was a terrible thing to see. Human beings can be very cruel to one another. We saw we were too late and couldn't do any good. We asked some people about it. They said everybody went to the show calmly. When the poor old king was jumping on the stage, somebody gave a signal, everybody in the house rose up and caught them. So we went back home, and I was feeling guilty, though I hadn't done anything. Chapter 25. Plan to save Jim. We stopped talking and started thinking. By and by Tom said, "Look here, Huck, what fools we were not to think of it before. I'm sure I know where Jim is." "Where?" "In that hut over there." "Why, look here. When we were at dinner, didn't you see a nigger man go in there with some food?" "Yes." "What did you think the food was for?" "For a dog." "So did I. Well, it wasn't for a dog. Because part of it was watermelon." "So it was, I noticed it." "Well, I never thought about a dog not eating watermelon." "Well, the nigger unlocked the door when he went in, and he locked it again when he came out. Jim's the prisoner. Now let's make a plan to steal Jim." Pretty soon Tom said, "What's your plan?" "My plan is this," I said. "We can easily find out if it's Jim in there. Then we can get up my canoe tomorrow night and fetch my raft over from the island. Then the first dark night that comes, we can steal the key and get off down the river on the raft with Jim. Wouldn't that plan work?" "Work?" "Why, certainly it would work, but it's too simple." "What's the good of a plan that is so simple?" He told me what his plan was, and I saw it was 15 times more exciting than mine. It would make Jim just as free as mine would, and maybe get us all killed besides. So I was satisfied and said we would start at once. When we got home the house was dark and still, so we went on down to the hut to examine it. We went through the yard so as to see what the dogs would do. They knew us and didn't make any noise. When we got to the cabin we took a look at the front and the two sides, and on the north side, we found a square window hole with just one strong board nailed across it. I said, "This hole's big enough for Jim to get through if we get off the board." Tom said, "It's too simple. I should hope we can find a way that's a little more difficult than that, Huck Finn. There isn't any hurry. Let's keep on looking around." After looking around the hut, Tom said, "We'll dig him out. It'll take about a week." Then we got into our room through the window. In the morning we got up early and went down to the nigger cabins to pet the dogs and make friends with the nigger that fed Jim. The niggers were just finishing breakfast and starting for the fields. Jim's nigger was piling up a tin pan with bread and meat, and while the others were leaving, the key came from the house. This nigger had a kind face, and his hair was all tied up in little bunches with thread. That was to keep witches off. He said the witches were troubling him very much these nights and making him see all kinds of strange things and hear all kinds of strange words and noises. Tom said, "What's the food for? Going to feed the dogs?" The nigger smiled and said, "Yes, Master said, a dog. A bad dog, too. Do you want to go and look at him?" "Yes." When we got in we could hardly see anything. It was so dark, but Jim was there, sure enough. He called out, "Why, Huck. Oh, isn't that Master Tom? I just knew how it would be. I just expected it. I didn't know what to do." That nigger broke in and said, "Why, does he know you gentlemen?" We could see pretty well now. Tom looked at the nigger calmly and said, "Does who know us?" "Why, this runaway nigger." "I don't suppose he does." "But why do you think so?" "Think of what? Didn't he just call out as if he knew you?" Tom said, in a puzzled way, "Well, that's very curious. Who called out? When did he call out? What did he call out?" And he turned to me, perfectly calm, and said, "Did you hear anybody call out?" Of course there wasn't anything to be said, but the one thing, so I said, "No, I did not hear anybody say anything." Then he turned to Jim and looked him over, as if he had never seen him before, and said, "Did you call out?" "No, sir," said Jim. "I haven't said anything, sir." "Did you ever see us before?" "No, sir." So Tom turned to the nigger, who was looking wild and troubled, and said, "What do you suppose is the matter with you, anyway? What made you think somebody called out?" "Oh, it's the witches, sir, and I wish I was dead. They almost kill me, they scare me so. Please don't tell anybody about it, sir, or old Master Silas will scold me, because he says there aren't any witches." Tom gave him a dime and said we wouldn't tell anybody. We told him to buy some more thread to tie up his hair with. And while the nigger stepped to the door to see if the dime was good, Tom whispered to Jim and said, "Don't tell anybody you know us. And if you hear any digging going on at night, it's us. We're going to set you free." Then the nigger came back, and we said we'd come again sometime if the nigger wanted us to, and he said he would, especially when it was dark, because the witches went for him mostly in the dark, and it was good to have folks around then. Chapter 26. Digging the hole. As soon as we supposed everybody was asleep that night, we climbed out of the room. We shut ourselves up in the lean-to behind the hut and went to work. Tom said we were right behind Jim's bed now, and we'd dig in under it. And when we got through, nobody in the cabin would ever know there was any hole there. So we dug and dug with our knives till almost midnight, and then we were tired out, and yet you could hardly see we'd done anything. Tom sighed, and pretty soon he stopped digging. Then for a good little while I knew that he was thinking. Then he said, "It isn't any use, Huck, it isn't going to work. We have to rush. We haven't got any time to spare." "Well, then, what are we going to do, Tom?" "I'll tell you. We have to dig him out with the picks." I found a pick among the old tools. He took it and went to work. We worked about half an hour before we returned to our bedroom. Next day Tom stole a spoon and a brass candlestick in the house to make some pens for Jim and 6 candles. I stole 3 tin plates from the nigger cabins. Tom said it wasn't enough, but I said nobody would ever see the plates that Jim threw out because they'd fall in the weeds under the window hole. Then we could carry them back and he could use them over again. So Tom was satisfied. Then he said, "Now, the thing to consider is how to get the things to Jim." "Take them in through the hole," I said, "when we get it done." He thought it was a foolish idea, and then he began thinking. By and by he said he had worked out 2 or 3 ways, but there wasn't any need to decide on any of them yet. He said we must let Jim know first. That night we went down a little after 10 and took one of the candles along. We listened under the window hole and heard Jim snoring, so we threw it in, and it didn't wake him. Then we started working with the pick and shovel, and in about 2 hours and a half the job was done. We crept in under Jim's bed and into the cabin. We felt around, found the candle and lit it. We stood over Jim for a while, and then we woke him up gently. He was so glad to see us he almost cried. He wanted us to find something to cut the chain off his leg right away and get out without losing any time. But Tom sat down and told him all about our plans. He told him how we could change the plans in a minute any time there was an alarm and not to be afraid at all because we would make sure he got away. So Jim said it was all right, and we sat there and talked over old times for a while. Then Tom asked a lot of questions. Jim told him Uncle Silas came in every day or 2 to pray with him, and Aunt Sally came in to see if he was comfortable and had plenty to eat, and both of them were very kind. Tom said, "Now I know what to do. We'll send you some things by them." I said, "Don't do anything of the kind, it's one of the most foolish ideas I have ever heard of," but he never paid any attention to me, went right on. He told Jim how we'd have to send him the rope ladder pie and other large things by Nat, the nigger that fed him. He must be on the lookout, not be surprised, and not let Nat see him open them. And we would put small things in Uncle's coat pockets and he must steal them out. We would tie things to Aunt's apron strings or put them in her apron pocket if we got a chance and told him what they would be and what they were for. And we told him how to keep a diary on the shirt with his blood. He told him everything. Jim couldn't understand the most of it, but he said we were white folks and knew better than him. So he was satisfied and said he would do it all just as Tom said. We had a good time, and then we crawled out through the hole. Tom was in high spirits. He said it was the best fun he ever had in his life. In the morning we went out to the woodpile and cut up the brass candlestick into small sizes, and Tom put them in the spoon in his pocket. Then we went to the nigger cabins. While I got Nat's notice off, Tom pushed a piece of candlestick into the middle of a corn cake that was in Jim's pan, and we went along with Nat to see how it would work. It just worked wonderfully. When Jim bit into the corn cake, it almost broke all his teeth out. Nothing could have worked better. Tom said so himself. Jim acted as if it was just a piece of rock that's always getting into bread, you know, But after that he never bit into anything before he pushed his fork into it in 3 or 4 places first. And while we were standing there in the dim light, here came a couple of the dogs from under Jim's bed. And more came until there were 11 of them, and there was hardly room in there to get your breath. Oh, we forgot to close that lean-to door. The nigger Nat only just cried witches once. Then he fainted onto the floor among the dogs and began to groan, as if he was dying. Tom pushed the door open and threw out a piece of Jim's meat, and the dogs went for it. And in 2 seconds he was out himself and back again and shut the door. I knew he'd fixed the other door too. Then he went to work on the nigger, comforting him and asking him if he'd been imagining he saw something again. He rose up, blinked his eyes around, and said, "Master Sid, you'll say I'm a fool, but I believed I saw almost 1,000,000 dogs, or devils, or something. I did, surely. Master Sid, I felt them. They were all over me. I just wish I could get my hands on one of the witches just once, only just once. But mostly I wish they'd let me alone, I do." Tom said, "Well, I tell you what I think. What makes them come here just at this runaway nigger's breakfast time? It's because they're hungry, that's the reason. You make them a witch pie, that's the thing for you to do." "But Master Sid, how am I going to make them a witch pie? I don't know how to make it. I haven't ever heard of such a thing before." "Well, then, I'll have to make it myself. I'll do it, seeing it's you, and you've been good to us and showed us the runaway nigger. But you have to be very careful. When we come around, you turn your back. Don't tell anybody whatever we've put in the pan. And don't look when Jim unloads the pan, something might happen, I don't know what. And above all, don't you touch the witch things." "Touch them, Master Sid? What are you talking about? I wouldn't lay my finger on them, not for $10,100,000 billion. I wouldn't." Chapter 27. The Witch Pie. That was all fixed. So then we went away and went to the rubbish pile in the backyard where they kept the old boots, pieces of bottles, wore-out tin things, and all such things. We looked around and found an old tin wash pan. We stopped up the holes as well as we could to bake the pie in. We took it down to the cellar and stole it full of flour and started for breakfast. Then we found a couple of nails. Tom said these would be for a prisoner to write his name and sorrows on the prison walls with. He dropped one of them in Aunt Sally's apron pocket that was hanging on a chair. And we stuck the other in the band of Uncle Silas's hat, which was on the table, because we heard the children say their pa and ma were going to the runaway nigger's house this morning. And then we went to breakfast, and Tom dropped the spoon in Uncle Silas's coat pocket. Aunt Sally hadn't come yet, so we had to wait a little while. And when she came she was cross. She said, "I've hunted everywhere, and I don't know what has happened to your other shirt." Tom's face turned blue. But Uncle Silas said, "It's strange. I can't understand it. I know perfectly well I took it off, because you have got one on. Just listen to the man. I know you took it off, because it was on the clothesline yesterday. I saw it there myself. But it's gone. And you'll just have to change to a red one till I can get time to make a new one. And it'll be the third I've made in 2 years. You should learn to take care of them. I know it, Sally, and I do try my best. But it oughtn't to be all my fault because, you know, I don't see them or have anything to do with them, except when they're on me." "Well, it isn't your fault, I suppose. And the shirt isn't all that's gone either. There's a spoon gone, and that isn't all. There were 10, and now there are only 9. Why, what else is gone, Sally? There are 6 candles gone. The rats could have got the candles, and I suppose they did. You are always promising you're going to stop their holes, but you don't do it, Silas. But you can't blame the rats for the spoon." "Well, Sally, I'm in fault, and I admit it. I've been careless, but tomorrow I will stop up the holes." "Oh, I wouldn't hurry. Next year will do." Just then the nigger woman stepped onto the passage and said, "Madam, there's a sheet gone." "A sheet gone? Oh, my God. I'll stop up the holes today," said Uncle Silas, looking sad. "Oh, do shut up. Do you suppose the rats took the sheet? Where's it gone? Lies. I haven't any idea, Mrs. Sally. It was on the clothesline yesterday, but it is gone. It isn't there anymore now. I suppose the world is coming to an end. I never saw such things in my life. A shirt, and a sheet, and a spoon, and 6 candles. Madam, came a young yellow girl, there's a brass candlestick missing. Get out of here, all of you. She was very angry. I began to look for a chance. I supposed I would run out and go for the woods till everything was all right. She was so angry, and everybody else very quiet. At last Uncle Silas, looking foolish, took up that spoon out of his pocket. She stopped, with her mouth open and her hands up. Then she said, "It's just as I expected. So you had it in your pocket all the time. And it seems you've got the other things there too. How did it get there?" "I really don't know, Sally," he said. "I was reading the Testament before breakfast, and I suppose I put it in there, not noticing, meaning to put my Testament in. It must be so, because my Testament isn't in, but I'll go and see. If the Testament is where I had it, I'll know I didn't put it in, and that will show that I laid the Testament down and took up the spoon and, oh, God. Give me a rest. Go along now, every one of you." So I got up and obeyed her. As we were passing through the sitting room, the old man took up his hat and the nail fell out on the floor. He just picked it up and laid it on the shelf. He never said anything and went out. When Tom saw him do it, he remembered about the spoon and said, "Well, it isn't any use to send things by him anymore. He isn't reliable." Then he said, "But he helped us with the spoon, anyway, without knowing it. So we'll go and help him without him knowing it, stop up his rat holes." There were a lot of them down in the cellar, and it took us a whole hour, but we did the job well. Then we heard steps on the stairs, so we blew out our light and hid. Here came the old man, with a candle in one hand, looking as absent-minded as before. He went looking around, first to one rat hole and then another, till he'd been to them all. Then he stood about 5 minutes, thinking. Then he turned away slowly towards the stairs, saying, "Well, I can't remember when I did it. I could show her now that I wasn't to blame for the rats. But never mind, let it go. I suppose it wouldn't do any good." And so he went back upstairs, and then we left too. He was a really nice old man. He always is. Tom was worried about how to get a spoon, but he said we had to have it, so he began to think. When he had thought out a plan, he told me what we would do, then we went and waited around the spoon basket till we saw Aunt Sally coming. Then Tom began counting the spoons and laying them out to one side, and I slid one of them up my sleeve. Tom said, "Why, Aunt Sally, there are only 9 spoons." She said, "Go along to your play and don't bother me. I know better, I counted them myself." "Well, I've counted them twice, Auntie, and there are only 9. Of course she came to count, anybody would. "Oh, there are only 9, she said. "Why, I'll count them again." So I slipped back the one I had, and when she finished counting, she said, "There are 10 now," and she looked annoyed. But Tom said, "Why, Auntie, I don't think there are 10. You fool, didn't you see me count them?" "I know, but, well, I'll count them again." So I stole one, and they came out 9, same as the other time. Well, she was just trembling all over. She was so mad. But she counted and counted, and 3 times they came out right, and 3 times they came out wrong. Then she picked up the basket and threw it across the house. It knocked the cat. Then, she told us to get away and let her have some peace. So we had the spoon, and Jim got it all right, along with the nail, before noon. We were very well satisfied with this business, and Tom said it was worth the trouble because he said now she wouldn't count the spoons again. So we put the sheet back on the line that night and stole one out of her closet. We kept on putting it back and stealing it again for a couple of days till she didn't know how many sheets she had anymore, and she didn't care. She wouldn't count them again. So we were all right with the shirt, the sheet, the spoon, the candles and the candlestick now. But we had no end of trouble with that pie. We cooked it down in the woods, and we got it done at last. It was very satisfactory, too, but not all in one day. We had to use up 3 wash pans full of flour before we got through, and we got burnt pretty much in some places. So then we went to gym the second night and tore up the sheet all in little strings. Then we made them into a lovely rope before daylight. We took the rope down to the woods the next morning, and in the end we had a pie with the rope inside that was a satisfaction to look at. Nat didn't look when we put the witch pie in Jim's pan, and we put the 3 tin plates in the bottom of the pan under the food. So Jim got everything all right, and as soon as he was by himself he got out the rope ladder and hit it. Then he made some marks on a tin plate and threw it out of the window hole. Chapter 28. The Anonymous Letter. Making the pens was a tough job, and so was the saw. Jim said the writing was going to be the toughest of all. Tom said a prisoner always wrote something on the wall. So he started to plan out a sad writing for Jim, like they all did. He made up a lot, wrote them out on a paper, and read them. Tom's voice trembled while he was reading them, and he almost cried. When he finished, he couldn't make up his mind which one for Jim to write onto the wall. They were all so good, but at last he said he would let him write them all on. Jim said it would take him a year to write such a lot of things onto the logs with a nail, and he didn't know how to make letters, besides. But Tom said he would mark them out for him, and then he could just follow the lines. Then pretty soon Tom said, "Come to think, the logs aren't going to do. They don't have log walls in a prison. We have to dig the writings into a rock. We'll fetch a rock." Jim said the rock was worse than the logs. He said it would take him such a long time to dig them into a rock that he wouldn't ever get out. But Tom said he would let me help him do it. Then he took a look to see how Jim and I were getting along with the pens. The work was hard and slow, and we didn't seem to make any progress. Tom said, "I know how to fix it. We must have a rock for the sad writings, and we can kill 2 birds with that same rock. There's a big grindstone down at the mill, and we'll steal it. We can carve the things on it and file out the pens and the saw on it, too." It wasn't a bad idea, and we said we'd do it. It wasn't quite midnight yet, so we got to the mill, leaving Jim at work. We stole the grindstone and set out to roll it home, but it was a tough job. We got her halfway, and then we were tired out and were covered with sweat. We saw it wasn't any use and had to go and fetch Jim. So he lifted up his bed and slid the chain off the bed leg and wrapped it round and round his neck. We crawled out through our hole and down there. With Jim's help, we rolled that grindstone along easily. Our hole was pretty big, but it wasn't big enough to get the grindstone through. Jim took the pick and soon made it big enough. Then Tom marked out the things on it with the nail and told Jim to work on them, with the nail for a chisel and an iron bolt from the rubbish for a hammer. He told him to hide the grindstone under his bed before he went to bed. Then we helped him fix his chain back on the bed leg and left for bed ourselves. Well, by the end of 3 weeks everything was in good order. The pens were made, the writings and so on were all carved on the grindstone, and the bed leg was sawed in 2. We had eaten up the sawdust, and it gave us a wonderful stomachache. We supposed we were all going to die, but we didn't. But as I was saying, we'd got all the work done now, at last, and we were all tired out too, especially Jim. Uncle Silas wrote a couple of times to the farm below Orleans to come and get their runaway nigger, but hadn't got any answer because there wasn't such a farm. So he said he would advertise Jim in the St. Louis and New Orleans papers, and when he mentioned the St. Louis ones, it made me worried, and I saw we hadn't any time to lose. So Tom said it was time now for the anonymous letters. "What are they?" I said. "Warnings to the people that something is up. Sometimes it's done one way, sometimes another. But there's always somebody, like a servant girl, spying around that gives notice to the governor of the castle. It's a very good way, and so is the anonymous letter. We'll use them both. And it's usual for the prisoner's mother to change clothes with him, and she stays in, and he slides out in her clothes. We'll do that too. But look here, Tom, what do we want to warn anybody for that something's up? Let them find it out for themselves. Yes, I know, but you can't depend on them. They have left us to do everything from the very start. They don't take notice of anything at all. So if we don't give them notice, there won't be anybody or anything to interfere with us. And so after all our hard work and trouble, this escape will be unexciting. So I said, well, Tom, what are you going to do about the servant girl? You'll be her. You go and steal that yellow girl's dress in the middle of the night. Why, Tom, that'll make trouble next morning, because, of course, she probably has but that one. I know, but you will want it for only 15 minutes to carry the anonymous letter and push it under the front door. All right, then, I'll do it, but I could carry it just as easily in my own clothes. You wouldn't look like a servant girl then, would you? No, but there won't be anybody to see what I look like, anyway. We must do our duty and not worry about whether anybody sees us do it or not. Haven't you got any principle at all? All right, I'm the servant girl. Who's Jim's mother? I'm his mother. I'll steal a dress from Aunt Sally. Well, then, you'll have to stay in the cabin when Jim and I leave. Not much. I'll fill Jim's clothes with straw and lay it on his bed to make it look like his mother. Jim will take the nigger woman's dress off me and wear it, and we'll all escape together. So Tom wrote the anonymous letter. I stole the yellow girl's dress that night, put it on, and pushed the letter under the front door, the way Tom told me to. It said, "Be careful. Trouble is coming. Keep a sharp lookout. Unknown friend." Next night we stuck a picture, which Tom drew in blood, of a skull and crossbones on the front door, and next night another one of a coffin on the back door. I never saw a family so frightened. If a door banged, Aunt Sally jumped and said ouch. If anything fell, she jumped and said ouch. If you happened to touch her when she wasn't noticing, she did the same. She couldn't face any way and be satisfied because she said there was something behind her every time, so she was always turning around suddenly and saying ouch. And she was afraid to go to bed, but she dared not sit up. So the thing was working very well, Tom said. He said it showed it was done right. Early the next morning, we got another letter ready and were wondering what we should do with it because we heard them say at supper they were going to have a nigger on watch at both doors all night. Tom went down to spy around, and the nigger at the back door was asleep. He stuck the letter in the back of his neck and came back. This letter said, "Don't betray me, I wish to be your friend. There is a gang of murderers from the Indian Territory. They're going to steal your runaway nigger tonight. They have been trying to scare you so that you will stay in the house and not bother them. I am one of the gang, but I wish to quit it and lead an honest life again. They will come down from the north along the fence at midnight with a false key and go in the nigger's cabin to get him. I am to be on watch and blow a horn if I see any danger, but I will call like a sheep as soon as they get in instead of blowing. Then while they are getting his chains loose, you slip there and lock them in and can kill them if you have time. Do as I am telling you. I do not expect any reward, but to know I have done the right thing. Unknown friend." Chapter 29. Escape. We were feeling pretty good after breakfast. We took my canoe and went over the river fishing with a lunch and had a good time. We took a look at the raft and found her all right. When we got home late to supper, we found them worried. They made us go right off to bed the minute we finished supper and wouldn't tell us what the trouble was. They never said a word about the new letter, but we knew as much about it as anybody did. As soon as we were half upstairs and Aunt Sally's back was turned, we slid for the cellar cupboard and loaded up a good lunch. We took it up to our room and went to bed. Then we got up about 11:30. Tom put on Aunt Sally's dress that he stole and was going to start with the lunch, but said, "Where's the butter?" "I put a piece of it," I said, "on a piece of a corn cake." "Well, you left it there, then, it isn't here." "We can get along without it," I said. "We can get along with it too," he said, "just slide down to the cellar and fetch it. And then come along. I'll go and fill the straw into Jim's clothes to be like his mother. I'll be ready to call like a sheep and run away as soon as you get there." So out he went and I went down to the cellar. The piece of butter, big as a person's fist, was where I had left it. So I took up the piece of corn cake with it on, blew out my light, and started upstairs very carefully. I got up to the main floor all right, but here came Aunt Sally with a candle. I put the butter in my hat and put my hat on my head, and the next second she saw me. "You've been down the cellar?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "No, ma'am." "Well, then, why did you go down there this time of night?" "I don't know." "You don't know? Don't answer me that way. Tom, I want to know what you have been doing down there." "I haven't been doing a single thing, Aunt Sally." I supposed she'd let me go now, but I suppose there were so many strange things going on she was just worried about every little thing that was strange. So she said, "You just march into that sitting room and stay there till I come. You have been up to something, and I'll find out what it is." So she went away as I opened the door and walked into the sitting room. But there was a crowd there. 15 farmers, and every one of them had a gun. I was quite afraid and sat down in a chair. They were sitting around, some of them talking a little, in a low voice. All of them were uneasy, but were trying to look like they weren't. I knew they were nervous because they were always taking off their hats and putting them on and scratching their heads and changing their seats. I wasn't easy myself, but I didn't take my hat off, all the same. I did wish Aunt Sally would come and question me and beat me if she wanted to and let me get away and tell Tom how we'd overdone this thing and what a lot of trouble we'd got into. At last she came and began to ask me questions, but I couldn't answer them well. I didn't know what to do. Some of the men were ready to start right now to catch the murderers, saying it was only a few minutes to midnight. Others were trying to get them to wait for the sheep signal. Auntie kept asking me questions, and I shook all over because I was so scared. The place was getting hotter and hotter, and the butter was beginning to melt and run down my neck and behind my ears. Pretty soon, one of them said, "Let's go and get in the cabin first and right now and catch them when they come." I almost fainted, and a streak of butter came down my forehead. Aunt Sally saw it. She turned white as a sheet and said, "Why, what is the matter with the child?" And everybody ran to see. She took off my hat, and out came the corn cake and what was left of the butter. She grabbed me, hugged me, and said, "Oh, what a surprise you did give me. And how glad and grateful I am it isn't any worse. When I saw that thing I thought we'd lost you, for it was just like your brains, dear. Why didn't you tell me that was what you'd been down there for? I wouldn't have cared. Now go out to bed and don't let me see any more of you till morning." I was upstairs in a second, but climbed down in another one. Then I ran through the dark for the lean-to. I could hardly say anything because I was so anxious, but I told Tom as quickly as I could we must run away now and not a minute to lose, the house full of men with guns. His eyes just shone, and he said, "No. Is that so? Isn't it wonderful? Why, Huck, if it was to do over again, I'm sure I could fetch 200. If we could put it off till..." Hurry, I said. "Where's Jim?" "Right beside me. If you reach out your arm you can touch him. He's dressed and everything's ready. Now we'll slide out and give the sheep signal." But then we heard the steps of men coming to the door and heard a man say, "I told you we'd be too soon. They haven't come, the door is locked. Here, I'll lock some of you into the cabin and you wait for them in the dark and kill them when they come and the rest scatter around and see if you can hear them coming." So in they came, but couldn't see us in the dark. But we got under all right and out through the hole, quickly but softly, Jim first, me next, and Tom last, according to Tom's orders. Now we were in the lean-to and heard steps close by outside. So we crept to the door and Tom stopped us there. He whispered and said he would listen for the steps to get further. He listened and listened and listened, and the steps were around out there all the time. At last he touched us, and we slid out, not making the least noise. We slipped carefully towards the fence and got to it all right. Jim and I climbed over it, but Tom's trousers caught on the top rail and then he heard the steps coming. So he had to pull loose, which made a noise. As he started, somebody shouted, "Who's that? Answer, or I'll shoot." But we didn't answer. We just ran on. Then they ran after us, and we heard gunshots. We heard them call out, "Here they are. They're running toward the river. After them, boys, and turn loose the dogs." We could hear them because they wore boots and yelled, but we didn't wear any boots and didn't yell. We were on the path heading toward the mill, and when they got pretty close to us we ran into the bush and let them go by. Then we went behind them. Now, the dogs came up, they were our dogs, so we stopped. When they saw it was only us, they just ran right ahead towards the shouting. Then we ran through the bush to where my canoe was tied. We jumped in and pulled for dear life towards the middle of the river. Then we reached the island where my raft was, and we could hear them shouting and barking at each other all up and down the bank, till we were so far away the sounds got weak and died out. And when we stepped onto the raft I said, "Now, old Jim, you're a free man again, and I'm sure you won't ever be a slave anymore." What a very good job it was too, Huck. It was planned well, and it was done well. Nobody can make a better plan than this one. We were all glad, but Tom was the gladdest of all, because he had a bullet in his leg. When Jim and I heard that, we didn't feel so glad as before. It was hurting him badly and bleeding, so we laid him in the hut and tore up one of the Duke's shirts to bandage him, but he said, "Give me the rags, I can do it myself." "Don't stop now. Set her loose." Boys, we did it wonderfully. Indeed we did. But Jim and I were thinking. And after we'd thought a minute, I said, "Say it, Jim." So he said, "Well, then, this is what I think, Huck. If it was he that was being set free, and one of the boys was to get shot, would he say, 'Go on and save me'? Never mind about a doctor to save this one? Is that like Master Tom Sawyer? Would he say that? Of course he wouldn't. Well, then, is Jim going to say it? No, sir. I don't move a step out of this place without a doctor, not if it's 40 years. I supposed he'd say what he did say, so it was all right now, and I told Tom I was going for a doctor. When he saw me getting the canoe ready, he said, 'Well, then, if you will go, I'll tell you what to do when you get to the village. Shut the door and cover up the doctor's eyes. Make him swear to be silent and put a purse full of gold in his hand, and then take and lead him all around the back streets and everywhere in the dark. Then fetch him here in the canoe, in a roundabout way among the islands, and search him, and take his chalk away from him. Don't give it back to him till you get him back to the village, or else he will chalk this raft so he can find it again. It's the way they all do.' So I said I wouldn't left, and Jim was to hide in the woods when he saw the doctor coming till he was gone again." Chapter 30. Huck returns home. The doctor was an old man, a very nice kind-looking old man. I told him my brother and I were over on Spanish Island hunting yesterday afternoon and camped on a piece of a raft we found. About midnight he must have kicked his gun in his dreams, for it went off and shot him in the leg. We wanted him to go over there and fix it and not say anything about it or let anybody know, because we wanted to come home this evening and surprise the folks. "Who are your folks?" he said. "The Phelpses, down there." "Oh," he said. And after a minute, he said, "How did you say he got shot?" "He had a dream," I said, "and the gun shot him." "Strange dream," he said. So he lit up his lantern and got his bags, and we started. But when he saw the canoe he didn't like the look of her. He said she was big enough for one, but didn't look pretty safe for two. I said, "Oh, you needn't be afraid, sir. She carried the three of us easily enough." "What three?" "Why, Sid and me, and the guns, that's what I mean." "Oh," he said. But he shook his head and said he supposed he'd look around for a bigger one. But they were all locked and chained, so he took my canoe and told me to wait till he came back, or maybe I'd better go down home and get them ready for the surprise if I wanted to. But I said I didn't, so I told him just how to find the raft, and then he started. I said to myself, if he can't fix that leg soon, if it takes him 3 or 4 days, What are we going to do? So I decided to wait. I crept into a lumber pile to get some sleep, and when I woke up the sun was up over my head. I jumped out and went for the doctor's house, but they told me he'd gone away in the night and wasn't back yet. Well, thought I, that looks very bad for Tom, and I'll leave for the island right off. So away I went. I turned the corner and nearly knocked my head into Uncle Silas's stomach. He said, "Why, Tom, where have you been all this time?" "I haven't been anywhere," I said, "only hunting for the runaway nigger with Sid." "Why, wherever did you go?" he said. "Your aunt has been very uneasy." "She needn't," I said, because we were all right. We followed the men and the dogs, but they ran faster than us, and we lost them. We thought we heard them on the water, so we got a canoe and took out after them and crossed over, but couldn't find them. We were tired, so we tied up the canoe and went to sleep. We never woke up till about an hour ago, and then we paddled over here to hear the news. Sid's at the post office to see what he can hear, and I'm going to get something to eat for us, and then we're going home. So then we went to the post office to get Sid, but just as I expected, he wasn't there. The old man got a letter out of the office, and we waited a little longer, but Sid didn't come. So the old man took me home. When we got home, Aunt Sally was so glad to see me that she laughed and cried both. The place was full of farmers and farmers' wives to dinner. And they were talking loudly about what had happened. I thought I could explain better why we were not in that room this morning if I went out to one side and think it over a little. So I did it. But I did not dare go far, or she'd have sent for me. And when it was late in the day the people all went away. Then I came in and told Aunt Sally the noise and shooting woke up Sid and me. The door was locked, and we wanted to see the fun, so we climbed out through the window. Both of us got hurt a little, and we never wanted to try that anymore. And then I went on and told her all that I told Uncle Silas before. Then she said she'd forgive us, as long as no harm had come of it. So she kissed me and patted me on the head. Pretty soon she jumped up and said, "Why, it's almost night, and Sid has not come yet. What has happened to that boy?" I saw my chance, so I jumped up and said, "I'll run right up to town and get him." "No, you won't," she said. "You'll stay right where you are. If he isn't here to supper, your uncle will go." Well, he wasn't there to supper, so right after supper Uncle went. When he came back about 10, he was a little uneasy. He hadn't found Tom. Aunt Sally was a good deal uneasy, but Uncle Silas said there was no need to worry. Maybe he would return in the morning all right. But she said she'd sit up for him a while anyway and keep a light burning so he could see it. When I went up to bed she came up with me and fetched her candle. She was so kind to me that I felt bad and couldn't look her in the face. She sat down on the bed and talked with me a long time. She kept asking me every now and then if I supposed he could have got lost or hurt or maybe drowned. I told her that Sid was all right and would be home in the morning, sure. She kissed me and told me to say it again because it did her good and she was very worried. And when she was going away she looked down in my eyes and said, "The door isn't going to be locked, Tom, but you'll be good, won't you? And you won't go? For my sake." I wanted to go badly to see about Tom, but after that I wouldn't go at all. But she was on my mind and Tom was on my mind, so I did not sleep well. And twice I climbed out in the night and slipped around to the front. Each time, I saw her sitting there by her candle in the window with her eyes towards the road and the tears in them. I wished I could do something for her, but I couldn't. I only swore that I would never do anything to make her sad anymore. And the third time I woke up in the morning and slid down, I found her there. Her old gray head was resting on her hand, and she was asleep. Chapter 31. The Doctor's Story. The old man went to town again before breakfast, but couldn't find Tom. Both of them sat at the table thinking and not saying anything. They looked sad. Their coffee got cold, and they were not eating anything. And by the old man said, "Did I give you the letter?" "What letter?" "The one I got yesterday out of the post office." "No, you didn't give me any letter." Well, I must have forgotten it. So he searched his pockets. Then he went off and fetched it and gave it to her. She said, "Why, it's from St. Petersburg, it's from sister." But before she could open it, she dropped it and ran, for she saw something. And so did I. It was Tom Sawyer on a mattress, and that old doctor, and Jim, with his hands tied behind him, and a lot of people. She threw herself at Tom, crying, and said, "Oh, he's dead, he's dead. I know he's dead." And Tom turned his head a little and whispered something or other, which showed he wasn't in his right mind. Then she threw up her hands and said, "He's alive, thank God. And that's enough." And she kissed him and flew for the house to get the bed ready. I followed the men to see what they were going to do with Jim. The old doctor and Uncle Silas followed Tom into the house. The men were very angry, and some of them wanted to hang Jim for an example to all the other niggers around there, so they wouldn't be trying to run away like Jim did. But the others said, "Don't do it, he isn't our nigger, and his owner would turn up and make us pay for him, sure." So that cooled them down a little. They cursed Jim, though, and hit him on the head once in a while, but Jim never said anything. He never showed that he knew me. They took him to the same cabin, put his own clothes on him, and chained him again. They said he wasn't to have anything but bread and water to eat after this till his owner came. Then the old doctor came and said, "Don't be rough on him, because he isn't a bad nigger." When I found the boy, I saw I couldn't cut the bullet out without some help. I couldn't leave him to go and get help, and he got worse and worse. After a long time he went out of his head and wouldn't let me come near him anymore. He said if I chalked his raft he'd kill me. I saw I couldn't do anything at all with him, so I said I had to have help somehow. The minute I said it out came this nigger from somewhere and said he would help. He did it too, and did it very well. Of course I judged he must be a runaway nigger. I had to stay there all the rest of the day and all night. I had a couple of patients, and of course I'd have liked to run up to town and see them, but I dared not. The nigger might get away, and then I'd be to blame. And yet never a boat came close enough for me to call. So I had to stay there until daylight this morning. I never saw a better nigger. He was risking his freedom to do it, and was all tired out too. I liked the nigger for that, I tell you, gentlemen, a nigger like that is worth $1,000, and kind treatment too, he went on. Early this morning, some men in a boat came by. The nigger was sitting nearby with his head on his knees sound asleep. So I signed them in quietly. They slipped up on him, grabbed him and tied him before he knew what had happened. We never had any trouble. We tied the raft on the boat and pulled her over very quietly. The nigger never said a word from the start. He isn't a bad nigger, gentlemen, that's what I think about him. Somebody said, "Well, it sounds very good, doctor, I must say." I was very thankful to that old doctor for saying such kind things about Jim. I thought he had a good heart in him and was a good man the first time I saw him. Chapter 32. And Polly arrives. Next morning I heard Tom was a good deal better, and they said Aunt Sally had gone to get a nap. So I slipped to the room. If I found him awake I supposed we could make up a story to explain what had happened. But he was sleeping, so I sat down and waited for him to wake. In about half an hour Aunt Sally came quietly in. She signed me to be still and sat down by me. She began to whisper and said we could all be joyful now because he was looking better all the time. So we sat there watching, and by he moved a bit. He opened his eyes, took a look, and said, "Hello. Why, I'm at home. How's that? Where's the raft?" "It's all right," I said. "And Jim?" "The same," I said. "Good. Splendid. Now we're all right and safe. Did you tell Auntie?" I was going to say yes, but she broke in and said, "About what, Sid?" "Why, about how the whole thing was done." "What whole thing?" "Why, the whole thing. There is just one, how we set the runaway nigger free, Tom and me." "Oh, what is the child talking about?" Dear, out of his head again." "No, I'm not out of my head. I know all I'm talking about. We did set him free, Tom and me. We planned to do it, and we did it wonderfully too. He kept talking, and she never stopped him. She just sat and stared and let him go on. I saw it wasn't any use for me to put in. Why, Auntie, it cost us a lot of work, weeks of it, hours and hours, every night, while you were all asleep. And we had to steal candles, and the sheet, and the shirt, and your dress, and spoons, and tin plates, and knives, and the grindstone, and flour, and lots of things, and you can't think what work it was to make the saws, and pens, and writings, and one thing or another, and you can't imagine what fun it was. And we had to make up the pictures of coffins and things, and anonymous letters from the robbers, and dig the hole into the cabin, and make the rope ladder and send it in a pie, and send in spoons and things to work with in your apron pocket. Oh, God. Then you kept Tom here so long with the butter in his hat that you almost ruined the whole business because the men came before we were out of the cabin. We had to rush, and they heard us and ran after us. We got out of the path and let them go by, and when the dogs came they weren't interested in us but went for the most noise. We got our canoe and made for the raft and were all safe. Jim was a free man, and we did it all by ourselves, and wasn't it wonderful, Auntie? Well, I never heard such a thing in my life. So it was you that have been making all this trouble. Once you get well, you young rascal, I will whip both of you. But Tom was so proud and joyful that he just couldn't stop talking. She said, well, you get all the enjoyment you can out of it now. I tell you, if I catch you interfering with him again. Interfering with who? Tom said, looking surprised. With who? Why, the runaway nigger, of course. Who do you suppose? Tom looked at me and said, Tom, didn't you just tell me he was all right? Hasn't he got away? Him, said Aunt Sally, the runaway nigger? Indeed he hasn't. They've got him back, safe and sound, and he's in that cabin again. Tom rose suddenly up in bed and called out to me, they haven't any right to shut him up. Go and don't lose a minute. Turn him loose. He is no slave. He's as free as anybody in the world. What does the child mean? I mean every word I say, Aunt Sally. And if nobody goes, I'll go. I've known him all his life, and so has Tom, there. Old Miss Watson died 2 months ago. She said she was ashamed she ever was going to sell him down the river, and she set him free in her will. Then what on earth did you want to set him free for, seeing he was already free? Why, I wanted the adventure of it. My Aunt Polly. She was standing right there, just inside the door, looking as sweet and happy as an angel. Aunt Sally jumped for her, hugged her, and cried over her. I found a good place to hide in under the bed. I looked out, and in a little while Tom's Aunt Polly stood there looking across at Tom over her glasses. And then she said, yes, you'd better turn your head away, Tom. Oh, dear me, said Aunt Sally. Is he changed so? Why, that isn't Tom. It's Sid. Tom's, why, where is Tom? He was here a minute ago. You mean where's Huck Finn, that's what you mean. Come out from under that bed, Huck Finn. So I did it, feeling ashamed. Aunt Sally looked confused, and Uncle Silas looked even more confused when he came in, and they told him the story. So Tom's Aunt Polly told all about who I was, and I had to tell them that, when Aunt Sally took me for Tom Sawyer I had to stand it, there wasn't any other way. I knew Tom wouldn't mind, because he'd make an adventure out of it, and be perfectly satisfied. And so he pretended to be Sid, and made things as easy as he could for me. And his Aunt Polly said Tom was right about old Miss Watson setting Jim free in her will. She said that when Aunt Sally wrote to her that Tom and Sid had come all right and safe, she said to herself, look at that now. I might have expected it, letting him go off that way without anybody to watch him. So now I have to go all the way down the river, 1,100 miles, and find out what he is up to this time, since I couldn't seem to get any answer out of you about it. Why, I never heard anything from you, said Aunt Sally. Well, I wonder. Why, I wrote you twice, to ask you what you could mean by Sid being here. Well, I never got them, sister. Aunt Polly turned around slowly and said, you, Tom. Hand out the letters. What letters? The letters. If I catch you, they're in the trunk. and they're just the same as they were when I got them out of the post office. I haven't looked into them. I haven't touched them. But I knew they'd make trouble, and I thought, if you weren't in any hurry, well, you deserve to be skinned. And I wrote another one to tell you I was coming, and I suppose no, it came yesterday. I haven't read it yet, but it's all right. I've got that one. I'm sure she hadn't, but I never said anything. The last chapter. The first time I was alone with Tom, I asked him what he'd planned to do if he managed to set a nigger free that was already free before. And he said, if we got Jim out all safe, we would run him down the river on the raft and have adventures to the mouth of the river. Then we would tell him about his being free and take him back up home on a steamboat and pay him for his lost time. We would get out all the niggers around and have them welcome him into town. Then he would be a hero, and so would we. We had Jim out of the cabin in no time. When Aunt Polly and Uncle Silas and Aunt Sally found out how he helped the doctor take care of Tom, they praised him and gave him all he wanted to eat. And we had him up to the sick room and had a good talk. Tom gave Jim $40 for being a prisoner for us and doing it so well. Jim was pleased almost to death. And then Tom said, let's all slide out of here one of these nights and go for exciting adventures for a couple of weeks in the Indian Territory. I said, all right, that suits me, but I haven't got any money to buy the right clothes and things. I suppose I couldn't get any from home because it's likely Pap's been back before now and got it all away from Judge Thatcher and drunk it up. No, he hasn't, Tom said. It's all there yet, $6,000 and more, and your Pap hasn't ever been back since. Jim said seriously, he isn't coming back anymore, Huck. I said, why, Jim? Never mind why, Huck, but he isn't coming back anymore. But I kept asking him, so at last he said, don't you remember the house that was floating down the river, and there was a man in there, covered up, and I went in and uncovered him and didn't let you come in? Well, then, you can get your money when you want it, because that was him. Tom is almost well now, and so there isn't anything more to write about. And I am so glad of it, because it is so much trouble to make a book. But I suppose I have to run away before the others, because Aunt Sally is going to adopt me and educate me, and I can't stand it. I have been there before. The end. Yours truly, Huck Finn.